this 9th meeting of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We appreciate your continued participation. It's been about a year at this point. I think our first meeting together was last November, so 1-year anniversary. Congratulations, everyone. So again, I'm Sylvia Chibroski, helping to facilitate this committee, and I'll just kind of go over our agenda and a few pieces. But before I do that, I just want to hand it over to Commissioner Stuart Warren to give us a bit of a welcome, and then I'll dive into the details. So over to you, Commissioner Warren.
Good morning. Thank you, Sylvia. It's so nice to see everyone's smiling faces here this early on a Friday. So thank you for being here. Today, the project team will present the remaining rules for your review. It's kind of exciting because this is kind of the final amount of rules we've had to make. So we'll actually get to see it in its kind of entirety. Looking forward, we'll hope to focus on areas within the rule drafts where you think more work is needed. And we are really hoping that you'll focus on the areas that you have the most interest in as well. And especially those of you who have the technical backgrounds to provide the advice that we need to make these rules really bold and strong as we need them to be. Staff Commission heard your concerns regarding the rulemaking timeframe. So the Commission extended our rulemaking timeframe by 2 months, moving our initial hearing on these rules back to March, and then hoping for a final adoption in May of 2022. The project team and Commission have also heard very clearly the need for assistance with implementation of these new rules. We understand that these will make a big change, and that's kind of what we're shooting for here. So we've started to work on what that looks like. I should say the staff has. The rulemaking process we are in now is the first step in the process, but DLCD and ODOT will plan to support implementation, and we're planning on doing that through guidance, technical assistance, and funding as well. And then we're going to really, in order to provide those things, what we're really planning on doing is adding staff capacity and then providing the resources and hoping for future support from the legislation. We know the adoption of these rules is just the beginning, and we have a lot more work to do, but we have to meet our climate equity goals, and we'll not do that unless we follow through with firm implementation of that. So thank you again for being here, and I want to challenge you today to be bold and to be willing to make change that we need. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Commissioner, for that great framing and the call to be bold to make the change that's needed. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes going over our agenda for today and some logistics before we dive in. So today we're going to start with just a review of the rulemaking schedule and the implementation date summary. So some of you at past meetings have been asking, what does this look like for implementation? What does that schedule look like? So staff has put something together and is excited to share that with you today. And then we're going to spend, getting into the substance of the meeting, we're going to spend some time with the transportation system performance standards, as well as the street and highway planning rules. So for both of those, this will be kind of the first time that you've really talked about these as a group in kind of a cohesive way. So we'll ask some questions and have some large group discussion on both of those topics. And then after a break, we'll get into revisions for the rules for climate friendly areas. So this is a place where you've had conversations as RAC members several times in the past. And so today we want to get into breakout rooms on the climate friendly areas and really ask you, are these rules on the right track? And if not, what does it take to get them on the right track so that they seem like they are in a place where you would want them to be for your vision of climate friendly areas in the future? And then we'll move into revisions for the electric vehicle charging and reducing parking mandates. And so for that piece, again, you've had a couple of opportunities at past RAC meetings to talk about these topics. And I want to ask you there too, are these rules on the right track? And if not, how can we get there? And then we'll just end with next steps and wrap up and look forward to our next meeting. And just a couple of process reminders and logistics as we move into today. You did receive several packets. I think it was 3 separate pieces, but the main one was the packet with the draft rule language and some of the summaries of the rule areas. Throughout the meeting today, we'll be using mostly kind of large group discussion and breakout rooms. For the chat, we've limited it to just chat with host only for troubleshooting issues. So if you have anything you want to talk about, please just raise your hand throughout the meeting to get in the queue, and we can hear your comments then. And the meeting is being recorded, as you know, and the recording will be posted on the website after the meeting. And for the members of the public that are listening in, you're always welcome to submit written comments to the DLCD email address, which is dlcd.cfec@state.or.us. And for members here, we'll put those links in the chat. We know this is a big part of your day, and we have a couple of breaks scheduled in, but please, stand up, take care of yourself as needed, get off video for a moment if you need to take a stretch break, and take care of yourself throughout the meeting. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Kevin to go through some updates and then dive into the rulemaking schedule and implementation date summary. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Just an update on a few things of interest to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. First thing I'd like to share is that we have upcoming next week a work session with the Land Conservation and Development Commission. This is kind of the first time the commission has done a work session, and essentially the structure is, the whole idea is basically to learn about the draft rules, give the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions, for staff to respond. No decision making will be made. It's kind of preliminary to the meeting that they have scheduled November 18th, where we will be providing an update to the climate friendly and equitable communities work. But we highlight that for members if you feel like it might be helpful to view that. It is a public meeting. You're welcome to join that meeting. There will not be an opportunity for public testimony at the meeting, but it's another opportunity to hear staff's explanation of the rules, as well as a question and answer from the commission. So that will be on November 9th. And let's see, I guess I haven't written down the time, but I'll put that in the chat for anybody who's interested in attending that. The next thing is I want to talk about a little bit about the question of applicability within the Portland metro area. We're continuing to work through that issue with metro staff and local governments and other interested parties in the metro region. You will see in the materials we present today a proposed approach to basically how climate-friendly areas, or actually town and regional centers, would work within the Portland metro region. In other topics, we continue to work through parking, TPR applicability with staff, and we hope to have kind of an update for you on that at our next meeting. So conversations are ongoing there. Lastly, we've had a number of requests for work groups. People are interested in kind of diving in on particular topics, and we think that's probably a good way forward. What we intend to do following this meeting is to send an email out to all members and alternates, soliciting your interest in participating in topic-focused work groups in a variety of areas. And we hope to use that process over the next couple of months to really refine the rules in specific topic areas. So look for that email coming out after this meeting and let us know if you're interested in participating. That's it for me. I think we move next to overview of the agenda. Is that right?
I think next we'll move into the rulemaking schedule and implementation date summary.
Yeah.
And before we do that, I want to make a note. I said there were 3 RAC packets. There was actually 2 main parts. So it was one part with, the bulk of the content, and then a second part that had the meeting summary from the last RAC meeting and public comments. There was an earlier RAC agenda that also went out that I thought of as a 3rd part, but the real packet is those 2 parts, to clarify. All right, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Kevin, did you want to talk real quick about the rulemaking schedule, or?
You bet. I can do that real quick.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about 2 items here. First of all, the schedule moving forward is on the screen in front of you. So essentially, As I mentioned, we will be going back to the commission on November 18th, the afternoon, to provide an update on climate-friendly equitable communities work. As part of that conversation, there will be an interagency panel on implementation of the rules. So this will be the directors of several other state agencies: Oregon Housing Community Services, Oregon Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Quality, to speak about how their departments can support our work as we move forward once the rules are adopted. We'll also review progress on draft rules and have some policy questions for the commission, just looking for some preliminary direction. Our next RAC meeting is December 17, where we will continue to look at revisions to the rules, including updated scenario planning rules. So if you remember, early on, we talked about Division 44. We haven't been talking about that much lately. We'll be bringing that back just to remind you and to make sure that Division 44 changes will work in tandem with the other things we've been discussing. And then in January, you, I think, just received an invitation to our 11th RAC meeting, which is scheduled for January 12th from 9 to 1. This is, we think, the last RAC meeting, and we should be looking at refinements to our final set of rules before we move those forward for commission consideration in March. We'll also be looking at impact statements there. In early February, we'll be again touching base with the commission just to review those draft rules, impact statements, discuss policy questions, looking for preliminary direction before we finalize that package of rule amendments, get those ready to be published by Secretary of State in time for the public hearing in March or April, maybe April 1st. And then, as we mentioned earlier, with final adoption hoped for in May of next year. On to you, Bill.
Good morning, everybody. Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. Thank you for being here with us again this morning. I'm going to talk real quick about an item that we sent in your packet. It's actually item 5 in your packet on page 14. It's a schedule of implementation dates. This is something I think folks have been asking for, particular, I think, local governments who we're going to be asking to implement some of these things. And I just wanted to point your attention to this. This document in this packet is based on the draft rules that are in this packet. So it may be, as we look over time, but to make revisions to really see how things are going to work and have these kind of topic specific. You don't have to really look at the slide. It's just a copy of what's in the packet. So it's too small to look at right now, but it's just showing you what's in the packet. It's basically, it lists every metropolitan area. It lists every jurisdiction in each metropolitan area in a big long table, multiple pages, and lays out by year kind of where we expect different elements of this rulemaking to fall, when we expect those things to happen. So I just wanted to point this out, give folks an opportunity to take a look at what this is. The main, I'd say, pieces that we put in here are climate-friendly areas, and Kevin will talk a little bit later at this meeting about what we've done to change kind of how that process works, to kind of spread it out a little bit more, kind of splitting out that designation process from actually doing the implementation, the zoning that's necessary to make those work. We also have parking requirements that kind of hit at a certain time, and those are listed in there in particular. We also put in, you can see HNA there. It's a housing capacity analysis, which local governments, certain local governments of a certain size under House Bill 2001 that got passed a couple years ago, are going to be required to do at certain intervals. Those dates and when those have been put in here too, so local jurisdictions can kind of see when those fall as well. And then there's a variety of other things that we put in here, but those are kind of the key ones I think that we wanted to bring attention to and let local governments know kind of that, yeah, we're looking at this, we're paying attention. And I think, you know, as we work with local governments around the state, we're going to be wanting to hear from you. And we've already talked with a number of you about how we can help make this work. You know, we are trying to balance the urgency of this work. The commission told us to to make sure that we can do something quickly. And that's something that's important. We know from the science, especially on the climate side, it's critical that this happens as quickly as we can. We're trying to balance that with the need to actually make it happen and actually let local governments who have lots of other things on their plate make this happen and be able to implement this successfully. So it's going to take some calibration. It's going to take a little bit of time and effort to figure out exactly where that balancing point is. And we appreciate your patience and help in trying to figure that out and get that calibrated correctly. So just wanted to draw your attention to that, and happy to talk about that or answer any questions.
Thanks, Bill. For RAC members, any questions or thoughts about that overall schedule or the implementation calendar? Feel free to raise your hand. All right, and let's go to Damien. And Rob, I see you have a question too. For folks that the Zoom platform sometimes changes, to raise your hand, if you go to the bottom of your screen and click on reactions, that's where the raise hand button is. But let's go to Damien and then Rob. And just a reminder to say your name and affiliation. Thanks.
Pardon me. Good morning, everybody. I'm Damien Cernick. I'm a senior planner with the City of Bend, the RAC alternate while Cassia Lacey is on leave. My question on the schedule involves the work we're going to talk about later on regarding planning for pedestrian bicycle transit infrastructure. Has there been any thought in terms of identifying when those updates to comprehensive plans need to take place as part of a TSP update, or are these going to be addressed really as local governments get around, maybe not get around, when they have the capacity to get this work done, treating those as amendments to TSP on their own schedule?
Yeah, thank you, Damien. I think we still have some thinking to do about how that's going to work. I think initially we thought that was going to just be part of their next regular transportation system plan update, that you would then your next TSP update, you do a TSP which met all the updated requirements. In the meantime, you'd use your existing acknowledged TSP and rely on that. I think we're thinking internally and talking with folks at ODOT about whether or not it makes sense to kind of there's a number of jurisdictions that have recent TSPs that have just updated, including I think City of Bend, and again, trying to hit that balance of, if you just did a lot of work and updated a TSP, when does it make sense to go and do an update, and trying to balance that with, obviously, there's a lot of, we're still trying to figure it out exactly how that's going to look, and whether or not we set some sort of compliance schedule for jurisdictions in the rule, that like we did with House Bill 2001. It's not something we've done with TSPs before in the past. I think we're still figuring that internally, and I think we're open to discussions with local governments about what makes sense there. But I think we're also, we've weaved the requirements into other parts of the rules that don't necessarily have to do directly with TSP updates, including climate-friendly areas. How do those interact if you don't have an updated TSP? I think we're still trying to figure out exactly how that's going to work.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Rob, and then Julie.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't find the raise hand function before. Now I know where it is. I also have a question about the work groups. Is now an okay time to ask that? Yes. Are non-RAC members allowed to serve on the work groups? Because we have, like, if it's like more of a land use work group, I would want a land use person at the city to participate, for example.
I can't remember if we've talked about that or not. Kevin, you just came off mute. I don't think we have a problem with that, but Kevin?
No, I agree. Obviously we want to keep these groups relatively small so we can hear each other, but I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
Also, I attended the parking work group, and my recollection is that it was more of a, let's say, an information session where we were sort of told, this is what's proposed. Do you have any questions? And it didn't feel like a roll up your sleeves kind of interactive. It didn't feel like there was openness necessarily to changing what was proposed on the part of DLCD staff. So I just want to encourage you to think about, like, how are these work groups actually, what's the dynamic going to be? How are they going to function? Is there going to be sort of appreciative inquiry? You know, and I think the work groups are an opportunity, and then this kind of speaks to the timeline, to maybe get an understanding of, for a local government, like how long would it take to do the meaningful public participation for these different elements that you're asking us to do in equity outreach? And then how long does it take to actually go through your planning commission process and your city council process to get to those, the actual adoption that is on the timeline that you showed, which I appreciate the timeline, but there's all that work that needs to get done. And we don't necessarily feel like DLC staff have reached out to us to sort of engage in, like, well, how long would something like that typically take? And I think the work groups could potentially be an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And Julie?
One thing I did not see in the timeline was the performance standards being effective January 1st of 2023, and how that sort of interplays with like the TSP updates. I mean, that's incredibly soon. And that would imply to me that you need to actually amend your TSP, which then gets a little bit confusing. I also did have a question about the major reports and the timelines for those, because I thought the rule said it was by May 31st of the year after an RTSP update. And in the case of the Salem-Kaiser area, that update is supposed to be adopted in May of 2023, which would put a major report in May of 2024, and yet your schedule shows June 30th of 2023. So my main question is really about the performance standards and how that plays into this.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look and see what I put in Rule 12 there, but I think we need to talk about and think about, you know, when a rule becomes effective and it's reliant on updates to a TSP, does that mean it's just the next time you update the TSP, you have to do that, or that there's some action that you have to take prior to that date? And I think we need to be clear about that. And I'm not exactly sure with the performance standards that I think we need to probably have some discussions about that. And if we have a work group on that, we can work those out. Or otherwise we can certainly, I'll be happy to talk with local government folks and figure out, and probably want to talk with ODOT people as well on that one.
Great, thanks. Let's just take one more question here. Jeremy. Oh, and I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, Jeremy Rogers with the Oregon Realtors. This is my first meeting, so I'm catching up on everything. But I just wanted to say that, you know, one concern that we would have on the timeline is that, you know, we've been very focused on House Bill 2001, 2003, and the housing issues, and our local associations working with local governments on implementing those housing rules. And I think it's just really important to listen to the feedback of local governments about their capacity and ability to implement these rules when they're also working on implementing those rules, and wanting to make sure that we're not taking away the focus on the housing efforts that are going on locally, and that including, you know, when cities are going to be doing housing production strategies and all of these other things required by House Bill 2003, that there's really the capacity and timeline to be able to accomplish those objectives when we're layering on these objectives as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think with that, let's move into kind of our first rulemaking substantive portion of today's meeting, the Transportation System Performance Standards. So I'll turn it over to Bill to walk through the pieces of the Transportation System Performance Standards, and then we just want to facilitate a conversation on, you know, is this rule getting us to the goals intended, and talk about implementation challenges to the rule. So Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Again, Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. Trying to talk about this rule, which is new in this draft. It's something we've talked about before with this advisory committee. It was 3 meetings ago, rec meeting 6, I believe, where we kind of give an introduction about what we were planning to do with this rule. I'd say since that time, our thinking has evolved a little bit. So you'll see how things have changed a little bit since we first kind of introduced this idea. But but don't worry, I'm going to go back and kind of explain what we're talking about here because it's kind of it gets a little wonky. So transportation performance standards, sometimes you'll hear them called mobility standards. Basically, we use them to measure our transportation system and to see how it's performing, how it's whether or not it's successful or not. We usually have there's a couple different measures that we use. We usually use level of service or VC ratio, and those are basically 2 different ways of measuring the same thing, which is when it comes down to it, and this is kind of be a crude way of putting it, but how many cars can go through an intersection at a certain time of day, usually during the peak hour. Now, VC ratio is something that ODOT uses on state highways, and then local governments will use that or level of service on their local streets. Those are the measures that are commonly used, and we can there's lots of details about how the engineers figure out what exactly the numbers mean and everything, but we're not going to get into that today. Just know that basically these measures have to do with measuring motor vehicle congestion. And don't really talk about other values that are important to us in our transportation system. They don't talk about safety. They don't talk about or address connectivity or being able to access goods and services. They're really just about number of cars that go through a certain intersection or segment of street. So we use them in a couple different contexts. One of them is to make transportation plans, to put transportation system plans together to make decisions about where investments are going to go. We also use them to regulate plan amendments and zone changes. So I'll talk about that here in a little bit about what that means. They also used locally to review development proposals in some jurisdictions, and they're also used by folks who are actually operating the transportation system, implementing and operating transportation systems and facilities when they, signal timing and all that sort of stuff. That's really not planning so much. We're in our rules really focused on those middle 2 pieces, regulating plan amendments, zone changes, and the review of development proposals. We're not really talking about the transportation planning piece of it because, frankly, right now, I think the practice is that a variety of measures are used and in that context. So that's not specifically something we're addressing today in the rule that we're talking about. But when local governments are developing plans, we do expect them to use a variety of measures. So we do, oh, that's a typo. I'm sorry. It's 170, and let me fix that for you guys here. Oops. Luckily, we can do that on the fly. Okay, so 170. What it says, it applies to plan amendments and zone changes that are reviewed under an existing rule. It's Rule 60. It also applies to review of development applications when it's locally required. And it's only certain local governments that require that, and there's no state law or rule that requires local governments to adopt or implement these in that context. But I just want to say this rule does apply to those as well. But we're mostly going to be talking about that first bullet, which is plan amendments and zone changes. So I think this requires a little bit of understanding of what Rule 60 is. And this is something that's been in the transportation planning rules for 20 plus years. The idea, kind of big picture Oregon's planning system is you do the planning up front. Okay, you do the zoning, you do the transportation planning, you do all the other types of planning that's necessary in order to get to a desired community outcomes in the future, right? In your comprehensive planning, all right? And the payoff for that is then everything that is figured out already. I mean, that's the idea. Is you then allow everything that's already planned for. So if it's zoned for something, there's a lot of jurisdictions in other states where you have to go through supplemental, discretionary processes to do a lot of different land development, which in our state, there have to be, especially for housing, clear objective standards that if you can check each of those boxes, you can do what you want to do. It's allowed. Now, locally, there's a lot of other requirements often placed on projects or on developments, but the idea is you do the planning up front, and then you can do anything you want to do. And when it comes to effect on the transportation system, that's what we assume. We assume that at the state level, the state rules, the way it works is you do all the transportation system planning in coordination with your land use planning, and you're able to do everything that's allowed under that comprehensive plan. So what Rule 60 does is says, well, you want to come in and make changes. Now you did all the planning up front, but now you want to come and change something. Maybe you want to be able to do a project that isn't consistent with the existing zoning. So when you have a plan amendment or zone change, you need to review that and make sure that you're looking at the planned transportation system and what the potential effect of that change could be on the transportation system. And basically, in the past, what present right now is we use often those performance standards that just have to do with motor vehicle congestion. So this rule applies to that. And it says, if I can click on the right thing here, that you have to adopt at least 2 standards in your transportation system plan. Now, it's required that you adopt standards in your TSP today. It's been required for a long time. We're just saying the updated requirement is you have to adopt at least 2 separate standards, and at least 1 standard cannot be related to motor vehicle congestion. So I will say we've had an evolution on this rule, right? We started off with don't have any standards related to motor vehicle congestion. That was pretty big change, right? I think we've talked with local governments, we've talked with our agency partners, and I think we've come around to the idea that it's important in a lot of places that we make sure that we are measuring motor vehicle congestion. It's important for a lot of reasons, and so we don't want to just do that. We want to make sure that we're incorporating other values as well. So that's why we've come to the adopt at least 2 standards. You can adopt more if you want. At least one of those standards cannot be related to motor vehicle congestion, but the other one could be, right? It still could be the same. And we expect, for example, on state highways, those are still going to have a motor vehicle congestion standard on those standards. But it doesn't have to be. If you have local facilities where you don't want to measure it anymore, you don't have to. So that's the direction we've gone. I see there's some hands up, and maybe I don't know, Sylvia, I can take a second here to answer a few questions if that's okay.
Sure, that sounds great. Yeah, Jenna.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to clarify, if you're adopting 2 standards, one of them can be based on congestion factors. And when those standards are in conflict with each other, then how do you how do you make decisions going forward?
That's a good question. And I think something we still need to, I think, the idea that we've had so far is that they both have to be met. And is there a possibility that you come across an issue where you can't meet either one of them because they are mutually in conflict? I don't know. I think that's not necessarily something, I don't know, Matt, you want to chime in here because you have a lot of thoughts on this as well, but I actually think Matt left. But I think that's something we still have to kind of figure out. I think we're hopeful that we'll be able to use it in cases where you'll be able to meet both of the standards. We might have to put in some language in there about providing flexibility for folks to be able to, if there's some sort of conflict. But that's a good point.
And my follow-up question, I'll be quick, is out of these 2 standards, are you saying that you could leave capacity out entirely? That is a choice?
Local government could make that choice. Yeah, we're not requiring them to keep that as a standard.
All right, thank you.
No, Matt is on it. If you needed him, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Matt is
in
on
here.
Oh, okay. I don't know if Matt, you had anything to add or not.
Not much. I think that is a complicated situation with there's 2 standards, and so part of the rule would direct the cities as they're writing it to describe how you're going to use both standards, whether it's a must meet both of the standards before a rezoning can be approved, or meeting either one of the standards is enough to approve it. And it would depend on what those standards were. So I think we didn't try to define that ahead of time, leave it up to the city or county to define that.
I see a couple other hands up. Are these kind of clarifying questions, or do you want to wait till after the discussion, Emma? I mean, after the presentation, Emma?
I can wait till the presentation's over. I just have some clarification questions about timing and implementation.
Okay, let's maybe get through the rest and then we can get to those questions. And Michael, did you want to wait until after the slide?
Yeah, I can wait. That's fine.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate your patience on that. I do want to talk a little bit more about another piece of this, which is Rule 325, which you'll notice is kind of in those 300 sections having to do with land use. And this applies to plan amendments and zone changes within a designated climate-friendly area only. So what I just talked about applies everywhere within metropolitan areas, but just within the climate-friendly area, this rule applies, and this includes the zone changes or comprehensive plan designations or land use regulation changes necessary to implement the climate-friendly area. As you'll hear from Kevin later on today, we're kind of splitting up that how that works. There's going to be a designation phase where you draw a line around an area, and that doesn't really change anything. It just says this is where the climate-friendly area is going to be. And then there's going to be a phase where you have to implement the requirements and change the zoning or other requirements in that area to meet the at least the minimum necessary under the rule. Now, in some places, maybe very few changes are going to be necessary. In some places, maybe substantial changes are going to be necessary, just depending what's there already. So this rule applies in these situations. So instead of review under Rule 60, which is what it would be required now in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, when you're implementing a new climate-friendly area, you need to do one of two things. You either need to update your transportation system plan to meet the updated standards and that have a TSP that assumes that you're going to have a climate-friendly area that meets the new standards. So basically, you're doing that, what I talked about at the beginning, right? You're doing the planning up front. You're good, right? You're planning, you're assuming you're doing your entire transportation system plan that meets that updated standard. You're set. You don't have to do anything else. So and that is pretty consistent with today, actually. If you do a TSP where you basically assume that land uses that you expect to have in the future, you're able to make those changes with relatively little hassle. Or you can do this thing, what we're calling a multimodal transportation gap summary, which is to look at the gaps in the transportation system within the climate-friendly area. So the summary, it looks at needs within the climate-friendly area. It focuses on pedestrian and bicycle network gaps. And in some situations where there's a state highway involved, you have to include what's called a highway impact summary. A highway impact summary is really making sure that we don't gum up the works on our state highway system, and just to see what the potential changes are that could happen that could affect movement on the highway system, because it's important that we keep that going for lots of reasons. In the future, so you do this kind of adoption, you get this multimodal transportation gap summary, and future amendments, when you're doing additional changes in the future, again, within the climate-friendly area, we're saying you don't have to do the Rule 60 analysis, but you may be required, depending on the nature of that change, to do some additional highway impact findings when you're close to an interchange, or have there's some other critical kind of state transportation facility that's nearby that might be affected. We want to make sure that we're taking care of those needs. So that, just in real quick, that's what we're talking about in climate-friendly areas, and happy to have any questions or discussion about performance standards. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bill. Yeah, so let's go to the hands we had, and then we'll pose a couple of questions too, but I know there were kind of clarifying questions about what was up there. So Emma, and then Michael, and then we can go to Rob and Jana. So Emma.
Thank you. I have a few questions, but I'll try to keep them short. My first one is about whether it would need to be co-adopted with the counties. I do see counties listed in this section of the rule. And I'm wondering, the two performance standards, do they need to sync up with the city and then the urban fringe area surrounding that city, but within the urban growth boundary? In which case, regardless, I have some concerns about the timeline. So if the commission takes action in May of 22, and this needs to be in effect January 1, 2023, in Springfield's situation, our council's on recess. Their first meeting back is in September. And September through early December for a co-adoption process is just not realistic. I think we need about a year total if it's going to be co-adoption to just get through the public hearing and the process and steps that are required. So that's my first question. Maybe I'll pause for a moment and then I have a couple of technical implementation questions.
Yeah, so I think Julie mentioned this in the beginning of the meeting as a potential issue as well. And I think we need to be clear internally about what that timeline means, what has to be done at what certain time. I think in my mind, the transportation performance standards are an adopted part of the transportation system plan. It would kind of be adopted at the time of your next TSP amendment. The way we've talked about how TSPs would work in the unincorporated areas within the urban growth boundary is, I think we're hoping that in most places those would be a coordinated unified transportation system plan, but understanding that in some places the county doesn't want to do that, and that's okay, or maybe the city doesn't want to do that. And then allowing for there to be a separate urban transportation plan for those places as an option. But I think ideally, we think it makes sense for the entire urban area to have a single transportation system plan, and then I think the standards would go along with that. Now, that said, we're not necessarily saying you have to have the same two standards everywhere either, and that you could have different standards on different facilities. In fact, I expect ODOT facilities, state facilities, are still going to need to have performance standards that are consistent with the Oregon Highway Plan. So that's going to continue. And they're going to be doing an OHP update here in a couple of years, so things may change about like what that looks like. But right now, those are still going to be in place, and additional local performance standards in addition to that, we're going to work through with that with ODOT. But this rule is the result of a substantial amount of work between our two agencies to get to this place. So I just want to be clear about that. ODOT's on board and has we've gone back and forth on this rule a lot. So that piece of it, I think I'm pretty comfortable that ODOT's happy with where we landed on that piece of it. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, or at least
that helps.
Yeah.
I think given the urgency of all the matters that we're working with in this rulemaking, it may make sense to decouple this element from a major update of the TSP, given the magnitude of work that's needed for a major update. I think performance standards could be achieved faster than it would require a major update. So just something to consider. My second question is about the capability of cities to implement the type of evaluation needed. So I'm wondering if the state would provide technical resources and if there might be examples of the different options A through H provided, because I think that could help the RAC members really picture, like, if you choose equity, if you choose network connectivity, like what does that actually look like if you pick it up and say, yes, this is the one we're running with.
Yeah. So thank you for that. That was don't have time to get into all of that in these meetings. I will say up in the Portland metropolitan area, Metro along with ODOT have been working on potential performance standards, updating what those look like in the Portland metropolitan area. And they've been going through this exercise for a couple of years and really getting into the details of what does that look like to measure all these different things. And if you have an opportunity to look at that project, and happy to sit down with some folks and maybe some metro people, metro area folks, and that they've spent a lot of time and effort thinking about this, and it's a really good resource. And I borrowed liberally from some of their materials for some of these things. So I think it's if you have an opportunity to take a look at that, I think some of that is definitely applicable to other places in the state for sure.
And with the resources to do, I'm assuming technical analysis is needed, like a city that is much smaller than Portland, will they have the GIS tools needed, or does DLCD step in and support with that?
I think it's going to depend on the different standards that that are chosen and become popular. I think some of them are not as resource intensive as even LOS or V over C, which require, traffic engineers to sit down and, they've got their models that they plug into, and they've got, they spit out different numbers. And, I think we all have to remember the status quo is not necessarily friction free, and just because we're used to it, that doesn't mean that there's no resources necessary to do that. But that said, I think to the extent that we can, absolutely, I think, we're interested in making sure that we can support local jurisdictions as much as possible.
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Emma. Michael, let's go to you.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand, first of all, we are talking about item 12, the draft transportation planning rules amendment, correct? Or am I completely off?
This is a part of that division 12. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so I appreciate the clause, I think it's in the purpose section on page 48 of the packet, where it recognizes the past practices that have been harmful for marginalized or disenfranchised communities. And I'm wondering how and whether we can recognize that public infrastructure does create barriers for people with disabilities, and be mindful of how we are going to plan on remedying those, reducing those, removing the barriers in our physical infrastructure.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I would say, we're trying to tackle that a number of ways. I would say, we have specific requirements in our modal plans, which are the rules that start in 500, go through the 800s, that have to do with our pedestrian, bicycle, public transportation, and street and highway planning, that make sure that we're removing barriers, that we're providing an allocation of resources, and prioritizing resources in a way that that moves us in the right direction. When it comes to the performance standards themselves, frankly, the existing performance standards, they're a mixed bag, right? They're talking about how many cars can move through an intersection over in the peak hour or something like that, right? Does that really help people that want to cross the street? Not so much. So hopefully some of these other performance standards can help balance that and say, well, there's this other thing to think about as well. And I think there's a lot more that I'm sure that you're thinking of that I'm maybe not addressing it exactly, and we'll need to talk some more about that.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the other aspects is, there are two ways of addressing it. I think one is the removal of barriers that are currently exist, and then also in planning, preventing the development of new barriers.
Yeah.
Because again, if you don't involve any people with disabilities in planning, you might inadvertently end up creating new barriers, because no one's thought about how someone with limited mobility is going to get from point A to point B.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we, as part of this process, also are requiring local jurisdictions, when they're doing their planning, to bring in people who are underserved populations, which include people with disabilities, to help make those decisions, not necessarily just saying, oh, we'll have outcomes that help, but I think you're right. We need the people who have those lived experiences to be in the room helping make those decisions. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And really appreciate those comments. And as we move to the next set of hands that are up here, just to kind of reminder of what these transportation performance standards are intended to do and to kind of help frame this conversation here. As DLCD said, the transportation performance standards are really intended to make sure that cities and counties are looking at a wider range of standards beyond just motor vehicle congestion standards, which has been the practice in the past. So the question is, do you think the rules accomplish this goal of looking beyond just motor vehicle congestion standards and incorporating other ways of traveling and getting around? And do you see any implementation challenges with any parts of these rules? And some of you have already been bringing those up, but just kind of want to focus on those two pieces as we have this conversation. And I will go to Rob and then Jana, and then we'll get to Jonathan and Julie. Oh, I don't want to say your name and who you are.
Sure. Rob Innerfeld with the city of Eugene. I do think that this is a step in the right direction. We went through a process. We actually had a transportation growth management grant from the state to create new rules for transportation demand management, and we tried to fold in what's called traffic impact analysis. So those are the local rules that apply to development that Bill had as one of the bullets, but he didn't really go into detail on that. Right now, ours don't apply to much development because there has to be at least 100 trips per hour, and it also doesn't apply to certain kinds of development that are more objective or needed housing. But we just struggled a lot with how to update our TIA standards to be less auto-oriented and basically like what to replace them with. And so I think both for that and for just the standards we would need to have for the plan amendments, that technical assistance is super important, sort of echoing what Emma said earlier. We would definitely need help with that. And I would encourage, I really would like to learn more about what's going on in Metro. And if you could put like a webinar together or something like that, I think that would be really great. The multimodal, one challenge is that it looks like the multimodal gap summary would be required to be amended into our TSP, or maybe it would be a referenced. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. And this could be like a follow-up item, some sort of flagging this for staff. But we don't generally have like fine-grained projects in our TSP, like a pedestrian crossing or sidewalk infill on a local street. We do a lot of those projects, but TSP tends to have like higher order projects. So I think that's a conversation to have. Also, it looks like the highway impact assessment would not need to be adopted or approved by ODOT. We would have to make findings and we would have to notice ODOT, but am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. And Jana?
Thank you. I have a comment and a question, and my comment is related to, I think, kind of around the idea of this multimodal plan and reducing VMT. I just want to share with you that we are very engaged at the state level in multimodal discussions, and often the desire to put all other kinds of forms of traffic on our road network is in conflict with freight needs. We need to think about that pretty seriously. One of the things I spent a lot of time in Portland doing is working on where we're going to put bike lanes next to freight routes. And so we need to think about that consciously in our planning from a safety perspective. But with that as a given, I was pleased to hear that congestion is still allowed to be a factor, but I'm questioning the comment that you made, Bill, about what it would constitute gumming up the system. I wasn't sure what you were getting at there, and I was looking for a little clarity, please.
I'm not sure I have clarity on that in terms of which I guess I may have said that when I was talking about the highway impact summary in the climate friendly areas.
Yeah, you said something about climate friendly areas only, change zoning to meet requirements, but then we don't want to, something about the impacts on the highway impact summary. We need to assess the imprints, but and then you said something about gumming up the system. And
I think it's important to, our agency partners that we're paying special attention to the state highway system, that it meets state transportation needs, and that local decisions around a climate-friendly area are taking that into account.
Well, and that's an important point, because particularly as been evidenced through this pandemic, a lot of rather than consumers going to stores, there's been just a lot of home deliveries and things like that, and that has a huge impact on the trucking industry. And so we need to make sure we keep those areas accessible. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jana. And Jonathan?
Yes, good morning, Jonathan Harker, representing the Oregon American Planning Association. My comment is, I think you're on the right track. My question has to do with, how does the work that's done under 170 and 325 relate to the work that would be required to do 910 land use and transportation performance standards and 915, which are performance targets? Just, is that work happening at the same time, and how does that relate to the, just how does the work relate to it? That's really my question.
I know it's confusing because we have performance standards and then performance measures, and maybe I'll let Cody, he come on screen here. Maybe I'll let him address that, if you would, Cody.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Cody Meyer, DLCD. So yeah, as Bill said, there's a difference. There is a performance standard, which is when you are making, and we're talking about 170, 325, when you are making a plan amendment, you're looking at a performance standard to say what would be the impact of this decision we are making. When we go into the 900 rules, those are performance measures. So that is an overall framework to set up performance-based planning to say, these are some things we want to track over time to get to the goals of increased equitable outcomes and reduce pollution. And so those are just kind of tracking measures. They're not set to make a decision criteria.
Oh, thank you, that helps.
I think it's important to remember a standard is really about a certain facility, and the measures are broader.
Yeah, thanks. And Julie.
So as the performance standards, first of all, Julie Warnicki, City of Salem, Transportation Planning. As the performance standards, would apply to changes to comp plan zones and also potentially to TIA requirements. A lot of that work is has to be done by, we require to be done by the developers, people who are proposing it. And then we have to have a way to evaluate whether or not it meets the standard. And I guess this goes along with the technical assistance, but I'm just looking at equity and how I have absolutely no idea how we would have a standard that we would tell, okay, developers, you need to do X, Y, and Z to show us, how, your impact is. So one of the reasons that, VC gets used a lot is because, the volume to capacity is because there is a methodology for doing that. And so without seeing these methodologies, it makes it hard to actually comment on, is this possible? And so I guess my assumption is that DLCD has a menu of, this is what we mean by an equity analysis. This is what we mean by a safety for all modes analysis. And these are the standards we would be looking for, so that so we can then, communicate that to the development community. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say we have an existing menu set right now. And I think we were trying to give local jurisdictions a lot of flexibility. But what I'm hearing is, maybe less flexibility and more hand-holding and guidance and technical assistance would be welcome. So I think I'm hearing that loud and clear, that we weren't trying to prescribe a particular measure. And I think we were trying to kind of, we talked about that. And I always thought, we should let 1,000 flowers bloom, let people try things, see what happens. Maybe someone comes up with something, and that's great. But I think maybe we are going to have to develop some additional guidance and help on doing this. And we may lean on some of the work that Metro's done, because they've done a lot of great work, Metro and ODOT up in Region 1. And see what other folks have done around the country and world, and see what good things are out there, and put those out as examples, and how those are then implemented, and the details of those. Absolutely, we can work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying take away flexibility. I'm just saying that there needs to be a little bit more information, and maybe it's that guidance. But I get nervous when, the rule gets made and then it's the promise of guidance. And so then the guidance takes 2 to 3 years to develop. And yet we are on a timeline that doesn't allow for that. So I think all these things need to work together. And, I guess the term safe harbor is also sometimes used. So
yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Appreciate that. All right, anyone else, any other, thoughts on these rules and whether they're really getting to that goal of moving beyond motor vehicle congestion standards and thinking through other travel modes? And if you feel like this is on the right track, a quick thumbs up with the reactions icon is helpful. If you don't want to get your voice in the conversation, or if anyone else has other thoughts or questions. See a thumbs up from Kari. Thank you. All right. Well, we did have a little bit more time devoted to this topic, but we can move ahead in the schedule, and we could take a break now, or kind of get into the next one and then take a break. I'm seeing yes for a break. Starting at 8 a.m. is hard, so I think we need a break earlier than later. So let's take a 10-minute break, and this is awkward. It's 9:03. Let's get back together at 9:13 and see you all then. Okay, hello, welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a snack. You got a snack or some extra coffee during your break there. So we're going to move into the next topic of street and highway planning rules. So I'll turn it over to Bill to give a little bit of framing about the draft rules, and then we want to get through some questions. And I do want to say, when we get into the discussion for this, we'll have large group discussion and kind of the same model of questions that we just had for the transportation system performance standards. Just want to get a sense from you. Do you think the rules are accomplishing the intended goals? And do you see any implementation challenges? So maybe be thinking about that as Bill walks through this piece. So over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Again, Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. After this, other people will talk, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. But let me see here. Street and highway planning. So let's talk about this a little bit. Hopefully most people are back from break. So these in your packet in the draft rules, these are rules 800 through 830. And what the point of this is to guide development of, it's part of developing local transportation system plans and making sure it's, planning for a complete street and highway system. And I wish I had been able to present this last time in coordination with the other modes that we're planning for. So, because they really are supposed to work together, right? Supposed to be doing coordinated planning with the pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks along with your street and highway network. It's all a coordinated transportation system that works together. So I'm just talking about this really today, but I really want people to keep in mind that we talked last time about pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation systems, and that these all need to work together. So I don't want people to lose sight of that and just kind of think about streets and highways and just that, because they all work together. So we know to meet our goals for climate equity, that many trips that folks take today need to shift to other modes. We've put way too many of our trips that could be done in other ways on driving, and kind of everything, that's just the way we've built our land uses and our transportation systems in this country. We know that there's still a lot of trips, some trips have to shift, but some trips just need to be shorter, like shorter driving trips in order to meet our goals. We know that there's a lot of trips that are still going to rely on driving. We just heard from Jana just a little while ago, still have freight. That's, most of that's not going to move to other modes. That's still really important to stay on the streets and highway system. There's lots of other, services, people making trips that just don't make sense on other modes. There's still a place for cars here. We're not, we're not anti-car, we're not getting rid of cars. It's a matter of using the right tool for the job. And what we've done over the last half a century is try to use a hammer to drive in a bunch of screws, right? We use the car for everything, even though when it makes sense to do is sometimes to walk, sometimes to ride a bike, sometimes to take a bus. That has problems too, right? It doesn't work very well. It takes a lot of space. There's a lot of negative outcomes, which we've talked about a lot of times during this process. So trying to make a little bit more sense of it, but that means there's still times where it's okay to drive, and you need to drive, and that's fine. So we still need a safe and connected street and highway network in our communities. So real quick, I'm just going to give an overview of the rules. This is something very similar to what I did last time with the other modes, and talk about what the rules do. So Rule 800 is just kind of the umbrella rule over kind of the entire mode, kind of get an overview of the different pieces of the street and highway system planning. Rule 805 is how local governments inventory the street and highway system. I'm not going to get too much detail about that, but I will note that we do require local governments to inventory designated freight routes. That's an important piece of that. Rule 810, and I'll talk a little bit more about 810 here in a second, or what we're actually saying what the requirements are for how local governments should plan and design local streets in their system. Rule 820, and just real quick, this the way we've laid this out is consistent with all four modes of travel. So that 0, 5, 10, 20 is kind of this consistent across all 4 of those. Rule 20 is how local governments develop prioritized system project list based just on the street projects. And again, very similar to how the other modes work, using a series of prioritization factors, working together with underserved communities to make sure that's consistent with their needs, and to put together that kind of how they prioritize those projects. And then a little bit different piece in this rule that we don't have in other rules is a rule that talks about how we authorize facilities that increase capacity in the street and highway network. So I'll talk a little bit about those 810 and 830 in detail here right now. So 810, this is taking a little bit of time and effort to get right. And I think obviously the reason we have an advisory committee is to help give us input and help us refine it even further. So if you've got additional feedback, we're happy to hear that. But we've worked quite a bit on this with our agency partners to make sure that it's something that's going to be balanced, that's worked together well with the other modes, and that we're getting somewhere that makes sense and is practical. So, but still is working to meet our needs. So I think it's key that we need to say that we needs to be a connected system, that we don't have a lot of dead ends, that we have we know that for a lot of reasons it's an important thing to have a connected system with minimum standards necessary. What that means really is that we're not planning a system with excessive lane width, with excessive number of lanes, with excessive just kind of size to it. That it's the minimum necessary to meet the needs for that facility. Now, in some places where you have freight or agricultural needs or even transit needs, sometimes you just need a little extra width on those things. That's necessary. That's fine. You can have those widths necessary, but there's a lot of local streets out there that have extraordinarily wide streets that just day to day just not needed. So it's really looking at the context of each facility, the function that facility is supposed to provide, who the expected users are of that facility, and really coming together with something. What do we really need here? And it's not one size fits all. One piece that we're asking for local jurisdictions to look at is an equitable allocation of right of way, considering the context. So in a lot of places, the status quo probably is fine, but we know that we need to shift how people are traveling, and that we've probably given too much space to people traveling by car and not enough space to people walking or biking or taking transit. That's going to be different in every kind of place. And in some places, you may be able to really make some major shifts in how that looks in some downtowns or something like that, where you really just have really wide streets. You just need to have a lot more pedestrian space, something like that. In those contexts is fine. And there's going to be other contexts where it doesn't make sense to do that. And it makes sense to make sure that you're maintaining that space for vehicles. It's really looking at being critical about each of those contexts and saying, what do we really need to do here? And making those changes in your plans when that's necessary. We want to make sure that local streets in particular, that we have a safe, slow, and connected local street network that prioritizes pedestrian bicycle travel. Local residential streets don't need to be very wide. They don't need to have a lot of space for through travel. That there's a lot of negative externalities to that, including people. I mean, how many different neighbors have you heard of, people worried about people speeding through their neighborhood? That's all comes down to road design, street design, making sure we know that places that have kind of narrower, closer in, smaller streets are safer for people of all spectrum across underserved communities, everyone, that if they're safer for people, that they're easier to walk and bike on, and more comfortable. A connected network is important so that we don't have a lot of dead ends, so that not a lot of additional travel generated by people making big loops to get to places, even though they might be pretty close to each other. There's no way to get from here to there except to go around. So connected network is very important as well. When we get to the larger streets, the collectors and the arterials, we want to make sure those are safe as well, that they are connected, that there's a connected network of those facilities, so there's none of out of direction travel, and that we're particularly in climate friendly areas that we're making sure that we're appropriately prioritizing the other modes of travel. So there's a couple different details in the rules about how that works, but basically we're trying to focus on particular places and say in these places we really need to make sure climate friendly areas in particular that we're looking at a balance that's a little bit different maybe than we've looked at in the past. And then and one little piece about freeways, and not every metropolitan area has them, but we want to make sure that we're setting up for the future that there's going to be potentially managed lanes of some sort, where there's a high occupancy lanes, transit lanes, things like that, and pricing in the future. We know those things are coming. It's just a matter of when and how those are going to look, and to think about those when we're doing our planning for the next 2 years. Talk real quick about 830 and the process we've put together for how proposed projects that would add capacity to the street and highway network might be reviewed. So I think we started from the proposition that we know that to meet our goals, the total amount of driving is going to have to go down, right? Per capita, the amount each Oregonian on average drives per day is going to have to decline in order to meet our goals. So that we know that just from everything we've done. That's including knowing about electric cars. All that stuff is already taken into account. We still know that that's going to have to happen. Some that's going to happen through shorter trips. Some that's going to happen through fewer trips using other modes of transportation. But the total amount of people drive is just going to have to go down. So when we look at projects that are going to add capacity to the street and highway network, we need to be thinking about those very critically. Are they really going to be necessary? Because the assumptions we've had in the past about consistent traffic growth we're going to have to flip those on their head, right? About, is that really going to happen? It should happen. It shouldn't happen, right? If we want to meet our goals, it shouldn't happen. So we need to think about those differently. So it's not saying don't ever add additional capacity, because it's going to be necessary sometimes. It's going to be necessary in places particularly that are growing, where there maybe aren't facilities now, or there need to be some additional facilities, where there are gaps in the system now, where maybe additional connections actually help the whole system work better. Those some things like that, those are fine. It's okay to do. We're not saying don't do them. We're just saying let's take a look at them critically. So that's what this rule is about. And so a proposed project would need to be reviewed through a process where essentially a local government needs to investigate, first of all, investments in other modes of transportation that might help meet the need of that capacity increase. Those are pedestrian, bicycle, public transportation, and the rule talks about those in a little bit of detail. And then there's a little bit about transportation options. Can there be programmatic transportation options, transportation demand management activities that can help also address that need? And then thirdly, we're talking about pricing and whether or not there are pricing activities that can help them meet those needs. Now, the pricing piece I know is a little bit futuristic in some cases, right? We're not quite there yet in terms of being able to price facilities, but once we're able to start doing that in a few places, we think it'll happen more and more in different places. So that's a little future thinking. Although today, local jurisdictions can price on-street parking, for example. That can be a strategy, a pricing strategy to help address some of the need for some of these facilities. So you have to at least look at these and say, what can we do with these other ways of meeting the need? How far can we get to meeting the need for this additional capacity before we move forward with being able to, I'm sorry, I had another slide, be able to put this project in the plan. So you could go through this process first, and then once you go through this process and make a determination, yes, we think we're going to need this capacity increase, even though we think we looked at everything else, that's okay. You just have to go make those findings, and then you're able to put that into the transportation system plan as a capacity increase. So I just wanted to outline that out, and then open to any questions or discussion about anything I talked about. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. Yeah, so let's open it up to any questions or, clarifying questions from folks. And then also just want to talk about in general, do you think that the rules are accomplishing the intended goals? Like Bill said, these rules are really meant to provide for a safe and connected network of streets and highways for vehicles that are traveling, and they are intended to work with some of those bike ped transit systems that we've talked about before, to provide that balanced transportation network. So do you think these are accomplishing that overall goal? And, if there are any implementation challenges that you want to flag, that would be great to discuss here as well. All right, so see hands up from Julie, Matt, and Damien. So I'll go to Julie, and just a reminder to say your name and who you are. Thanks.
Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Salem. Just a clarifying question. So for the vehicle capacity, whatever you're calling them, increasing facilities, is it the DLCD's intention that this analysis be done for all projects that we currently have within our adopted transportation system plans, or only for new things that we would be proposing?
Yeah, great question. The way I think about it is local governments have existing acknowledged transportation system plans. They're acknowledged, they're on the books, you get those are there, right? When you're doing a TSP update that meets the updated standards, any project that's going to be in that updated TSP will have to have gone through this process. So it's at the time of doing a TSP update that you'll need, if there's any existing projects that are on the books that you'll want to continue to keep, you're going to need to go through these processes. If there's new ones that you want to add, they're going to have to go through this process. But if you haven't done your TSP update yet, if you've got acknowledged TSP, you get to keep, we don't have a way to go back and take away acknowledged plans, so that will stay there.
Okay, but for example, I'm thinking about Kubler-Cordon Road out by the Mill Creek Corporate Center in Salem. And, that has long been planned to be a 5-lane facility, or 2 lanes each direction with turn pockets. And so what I hear you saying is that in order to keep that in our plan, after we do an update, we will have to have done this analysis to include it in there.
Yeah. And taking that example, you'd say, do we really need a 5-lane out there or not? I mean, that's the first question to ask, and what's the need for it? And to really think about that. And if there, that's a growing area, there's additional businesses being built out there, and it's industrial park. There's a lot of greenfield development capacity out there. I understand that. You find that there is a need, then you have to look at the alternatives out there and say what's reasonable out there. And you may end up coming to the end like, yeah, this is really the kind of facility we need. Or you can say, geez, at the end of the day, maybe we don't need to do this whole facility out there, and then that wouldn't be added to your plan.
Okay. Yeah, I see this as it's a lot of work, what you guys are proposing. But okay.
I'll be honest with you. We're trying to add a additional kind of speed bump to the process of how capacity increases happen in the street and highway system. It's better. We're trying to really make sure that we're being thoughtful about them, because I think the status quo is that's what we do. And we just do that. And then we don't really think about, we've talked a lot about a balanced system, but a lot of investment goes into the street and highway network. And we know we need to shift those. We are trying to add a little bit of additional little thoughtfulness to that. And if we need to make some tweaks or changes to how this works, that's fine. But that's kind of the point, is there a little bit of extra work to do these.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, Julie. Let's go to Matt.
Thanks, Matt Brinkley, Planning Director, City of Medford. And Julie kind of asked one of the questions that I had, so thanks. But Bill, I think when you describe it as a little speed bump, I mean, this strikes me as kind of like a NEPA light or moderate, I'm not sure which. So yeah, I can see the need for making it a little bit more difficult and investing a little more thought and considering alternatives, but I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned that there aren't, some sideboards on this. This seems like a whole lot of work that would just end up being very difficult for a lot of communities to do, certainly smaller, medium-sized communities. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions, make a couple of comments about 810. The first one has to do with parens 1, where you're talking about local street networks, and agree with you that a lot of local streets can be smaller, but local streets are important not just for kind of moving various kinds of traffic, non-motorized as well as motorized. These are also, in a place like Southern Oregon, our means of evacuating people. And 13 months out from the Alameda fire, I am really concerned about having this rule that would limit us to 28 feet for all local streets. I mean, and that's with on-street parking. So 14 feet for parking leaves us with maybe 14 feet of travel lane. That's not enough to get emergency vehicles into an incident area and get people out. That we saw that firsthand last year, what was nearly it was a catastrophe, but not quite what we've seen in other places like Paradise, for example. So I'm wondering what consideration you have made for those kinds of conditions. And then my second one on 810 is, it looks like you're asking cities and counties to plan for freeways. Freeways is defined in the rule, strike me as interstates, or at least state facilities that are managed by ODOT. And as much as I would like to tell ODOT how to manage their facilities in some cases, that is just not how it works. So are we responsible for state facilities now? And if so, could you please communicate that to our friends at the Department of Transportation?
Yes, I'll take your second question first, and I think maybe we have a little bit more calibration left to do on this, but clearly ODOT has responsibility for state facilities, but this is a tricky balance, right? The state, all its agencies need to be consistent with local comprehensive plans as well. Now, that's not to say you can go and just require whatever you want on a state facility and ODOT has to do it. It doesn't work that way. But there's a give and take there, and we're trying to push a little bit about where we think the future is going to be on freeways, and maybe we need to adjust that or be clearer about what that looks like. But I don't think if you're a local government and you've got a freeway in your jurisdiction, I don't think you can just leave it as a blank spot in your TSP. I think that needs to be something that talks about what that facility is, a part of your transportation system. It needs to be a piece of that. As far as your first question about emergency access and evacuation in local neighborhoods, I think that's a critical piece. I think that's one main reason why we're really hitting the connectivity piece hard, that we don't have a lot of disconnected or dead end streets or neighborhoods, that we're making sure that there's multiple ways to get at or get out of places. It's super important for lots of emergency reasons. And the 28 foot, I think the way we ended up writing that gave local governments some more flexibility about what that looks like. And I don't think we want to see every street be wider than that, but if it's important for key streets, just because of the land development pattern, or because of the uses or expected function of that facility to be wider and need to be a little bit more spacious, that's fine. I think the way we wrote that rule, that we've given that flexibility to local governments, but they need to be thoughtful about that. And I think we, in the past half a century, there's a lot of places where we haven't been thoughtful. We just put 40-foot streets or whatever, all over the place, and it's overkill. So we're trying to push back on that while making sure that we're still meeting all our other goals as well.
Thanks. Let's go to Damien and then Jana.
All right, thank you. I've got two clarifying questions. So, and I think this applies to 810 regarding connected local streets. Recently, with the adoption of our BEN TSP, we've identified kind of low stress networks, neighborhood greenways on local streets where people can travel on foot or by bike to get from point A to point B, particularly for areas like, to get to schools, get to parks, neighborhood commercial areas. Is there the reason I bring that up is to ask, is there a goal or an aspiration then to try to look at more of routes like that on our connected streets so that there's potentially less conflicts between people making trips that way with other trips being made by car? Second question is really focused on the climate friendly areas. I think if I'm correct, well, this is why I'm asking the question, to see if I'm correct. So as we're looking at climate friendly areas, these are areas where if we have arterials and collectors going through these areas, that's where, unlike maybe the work we've done before, we're looking at paying a higher level of attention to prevent those kind of conflicts, minimize, mitigate risks, but also make sure that travel is available through other modes like by foot, by bike, by transit. The recognition that other modes might need to slow down, make more stops. They might have to make more decisions as they're going through these areas to ensure people are traveling safety. So those are my two clarifying questions.
Okay, just real quick, your first question was about, I'm sorry.
Connected streets.
Connected. Oh, and how that connects with bike and ped, or?
Right. Is there I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Is it like an aspiration or a goal to rely more on local streets for sure, those kinds of trips? Second question was focused on CFAs and dealing with all those modes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you have to remember that, we design these rules together. So I think you need to look at the pedestrian and bicycle rules along with the street and highway rules. And I think we tried to come up with a balance for how that works. Now, I think in a local residential street network, our idea is that, those are going to be very permeable by everybody. And when, there may be conflicts, you get speeding or you get a lot of through travel of motor vehicles, that you have the opportunity to have interventions in that street network where it's necessary to slow down or to divert motor vehicle traffic, but you still have that permeability by the pedestrian and bicycle folks. That's the idea, I think, that we're trying to get across there. And I think that's getting at what you're saying. But we absolutely want every local street to be accessible by people who are walking, and sometimes that will be just on the street, and that's okay if it's a very narrow and small and slow street. And then in terms of bicycling, sometimes those are a key part of a connected network of streets to get folks across, even not just within the neighborhood, but across a neighborhood or within a community. So absolutely. And then within climate friendly areas, I think, this is something where we're trying to, have people pay special attention and just really, what do those streets look like in a climate friendly areas? It's going to be a more urban type of context in the future. There's going to be more people walking, bicycling, and using transit in these places. And you may not be able to, you're not gonna be able to drive through as quickly maybe as you were before. It's going to be a different type of street, different type of context. And that's just what those areas are going to look like. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
With question 2, yes, thank you. With question 1, I think I may circle back with you and the team after I've had a chance to look at these rules in conjunction with the take a closer look at the bike ped transit rules, pardon me.
Great.
Thanks, Damien. Jana, over to you. And then I think Margie has to leave a little early, so let's have Margie go after that, if that's okay. Go ahead, Jana.
Thank you. Bill, this may sound like heresy to you, but I would say that connectivity is more involved than simply one path, one narrow path from one point to another. And I think that Matt's comments about the evacuation needs in the Medford area are integral to this discussion. If we're going to talk about safety, we need to make sure we can get people in and out safely. And so this idea of narrowing streets and restricting access may work under optimum conditions, but they certainly may not work when the conditions are not optimum. And what I don't understand in this whole discussion is historically, transportation routes brought economic prosperity to regions. I mean, you can go back to the Roman times, and the first thing they did was build roads to the areas that they had conquered because they understood the value of being able to transport people and goods from one area to the other. And this notion that we're going to move away from using vehicles, cars, is I don't understand, in light of the same efforts to push us into electric vehicles, why we're trying to move people out of cars at the same time, particularly with a population that's aging. I will speak to that personally. I'm going to be much less likely to bicycle to work than I would have been maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So I'm confused by all of these goals. They seem to be contradictory in their purposes. And I'm looking for some clarity there, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry things have been unclear because I think we may be talking past each other or something there, because when it comes to, say, the network of local streets, absolutely what we're saying is that there should be a network. It should be a connected network. It's not just one path of getting from here to there. There's multiple ways of getting around in any of these modes, and that we're not limiting people to a single path. I think that's critical. So I think we're on the same page there. And let's see. Then you said a couple other things. So when it comes to shifting our investments and shifting how people are going to be traveling, I'll start real quick with why. I mean, there's lots of reasons that we've been trying to do this for a long time, but for the climate reason and the greenhouse gas reason is, the cars that are being sold off lots today are 90+% not electric, right? Those cars are going to be on the road for 15, 20 plus years, right? I mean, the cars they build today last a long time. So, even if the most aggressive scenarios on transportation electrification come to pass, there's still going to be lots of cars that burn gas or diesel on the road for decades to come. So that's why, and this isn't from DLCD, this is from the statewide transportation strategy that was adopted by the Transportation Commission, says this. This is where we get these numbers from, is that we know the total amount of driving on average per Oregonian has to decline. Now, I absolutely agree with you that investments in transportation are critical to making our economy work. Absolutely agree. What I'm saying is it's not just cars on roads that it's investment in transportation, right? Everything else is also an investment in transportation, and we've been under-investing in those modes, and that's why they've been underperforming. And so
but they're the payers into the system, Bill. That's the problem. The more you move people out of the vehicles, the less revenue you have to build the roads. So
yeah, that's obviously, there's some conversations that need to be had that aren't in our DLCD's rulemaking about how we fund the transportation system. And I see Amanda Pizza's in the room, and I don't know if she wants to speak up or not. Probably not right now, but that's probably we'd be sidetracking this conversation to talk about that. And obviously, there's some big discussions that need to happen at different levels about how the system is funded. Real quick, I just do want to address one comment you made about the aging population. That's absolutely an issue. And I know, in my family, and lots of other families have had the difficult conversations with parent or grandparent that aren't able to drive anymore, and they might be kind of might have to take away the keys. And, this happened with my grandfather, where it's tough, and people are getting sometimes stuck in their homes because we've built places where people are reliant on having to drive. And if you're not allowed, you can't drive anymore, whether it's because of a disability, whether it's because you're elderly now, or if you're too young. There's lots of reasons why people can't drive. They're stuck. And the more ways we can get people to be able to participate in the community without having to be stuck in their car, I think the better off we're going to be. So, obviously, was my grandpa going to hop on a bicycle? No, he was not going to do that. But the more options we have available to people, the better. So I don't know if I got every piece that you talked about, but I don't know, Sylvia.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. And I just do want to also point out, I mean, these rules are a big change for the cities. They're a big change for everyone who kind of lives, could be a big change for folks that live in Oregon. And the goal here is to provide for safe, connected network of streets and highways for motor vehicles and also other modes. So if people see a different way to get to that goal, please, this is the place to bring that up and to bring that into the conversation. Let's go to Margie and then Elisa and Emma. Margie.
Hi, thanks. These are all these pieces of the rule are very complicated, and I just appreciate DLCD staff first willing to do the workshops. I think that will be very helpful. One of the things that we've been talking through with our partners and with DLCD is thinking about the local planners in our region and duplication of potential application of standards and or duplicating work. And the other thing we're trying to kind of pull apart is, who really makes the decisions in terms of putting together the TSP project list and what are those roadways. So I have a couple of specific comments as it relates to that kind of general theme. I think first, there's a lot of reference to highways, and highways as a term is not recognized in our RTP. We use the term throughways. But regardless, as it's defined by the ORS and state law, that includes a lot of arterials in our region. This may not be unique to metro area. That includes things like TV Highway, 82nd Avenue, Powell Avenue, often known as orphan highways. So I would just flag that as something thinking through whether you want your rule to also apply to those arterials that are defined as highways in state law. The converse of that is, there are also highway projects that are more typical interstate highway projects that are selected by ODOT or the Oregon Transportation Commission in their STIP that must be reflected in local TSPs. So in our case, we have major projects underway: Rose Quarter, I-5 Bridge, I-205, and those local projects are in the local TSPs. And so I think about whether or not what is the local's responsibility, not only to analyze those, but to also monitor and essentially be responsible for those large projects in their TSPs. It could be that you carve out some of the ODOT-owned roadways, and I'm sure you've talked to ODOT about this. It had some other kind of application of those roadways that the locals aren't necessarily responsible for in terms of analysis and monitoring. So thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think maybe we have a little bit more discussion to do with our agency partners on that.
Thank you. And let's go to Elisa.
Hi, I'm Elisa Chang from Ben Bikes. I wanted to state that I think that narrow streets with reducing traffic speeds is a good thing, and I applaud your abilities to do that. There are other users of the street system that, other than cars, and having a narrower street will create more livable communities, which I am for, but I have two clarification questions. One is to echo what Matt was saying, that a lot of these rules say cities and counties must plan for this. Are they the only ones that are planning, or is anybody that's making a street would this also apply to them? That's my first question. And my second question is, do the projects that this covers, do only new streets qualify for that? Or if you're resurfacing a street or repaving a street or doing something, does that also need this analysis too then?
Yeah, so thank you. So cities and counties are the entities, and it's probably mostly going to be cities, frankly. Whether or not counties will really be doing a lot of this, we'll see. But are the entities who are doing the local transportation system plans, which is really what this is about. This is about a local transportation system plan and how that works. So that's why we say cities and counties. Your second question, was that specifically about the capacity improvement thing, or was that about just like the general standards?
Kind of both the general standards and the capacity.
Yeah, I'm mostly going to apply, I think, to new or rebuilt facilities, and not so much to existing facilities that are being maintained. So kind of just general resurfacing, repaving, those type of activities are maintenance activities, restriping, all that kind of stuff. Those are maintenance activities which really don't fit inside the transportation system plan. It's really just maintaining the facilities that exist. And we require, and this is existing rule and will continue, that local governments, and that includes public works departments, things like that, have to be consistent with local TSPs. All their standards, things like that, have to be consistent with local TSPs, which have to be consistent with our rules. So there is kind of that trickle down a little bit, but that the kind of everyday kind of filling potholes type of work it just kind of assumed to be kind of a separate thing from kind of the planned projects, which are kind of the new facilities. Sometimes even local streets aren't a planned project. They're part of a development project or something like that. But those have to meet the standards. Yeah.
I meant more like if you were rebuilding the entire street from the ground up, like not just filling a pothole, but it was an existing street and you are rebuilding it because, say, you had to do utility work that took out all of the pipes underneath the street.
Yeah.
Then does that apply? Like, where's the line between when it's a new street versus?
It starts to get fuzzy. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the, do they have to move curbs? Do they have to change the storm drainage? I mean, if it's kind of big project like that, I would say yes, absolutely. They probably have to meet the new standards. They should meet the new standards. But it's expensive to move curbs. It's expensive to change storm drainage. Those are two things I know are expensive to do. And if you don't have to do those things that or would require doing those things to meet the new standards, but you don't otherwise have to do them, I think we're reluctant to say. I mean, that you're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars sometimes in these projects to do some of those things, and that starts to add up. So I think those are probably more maintenance rather than new.
Thank you. Let's go to Emma and then Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you. Emma Newman, City of Springfield Senior Transportation Planner. I think some elements in here are good and could really help a lot. But I have some concerns about kind of how they're being proposed and implemented. On the topic of narrow streets, I think this also ties to the parking sections in the rules, because narrow streets can work and have benefits, but they need to be paired with parking management to avoid the public safety concerns that I've consistently brought up in other meetings, and I don't feel like that's really been heard and addressed yet in this rulemaking. So I just want to bring that up. More specifically with the 0830 subsection 1, which is calling out the adding capacity, I would love to see an exemption added for roundabouts, because it doesn't make sense to have much more involved process and analysis to be able to use a tool in the toolbox that both improves safety, which I'm hearing is a value of this rulemaking, as well as reduces idling and thus greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that should be an exemption added. And then a little bit more broadly, if I'm reading the section 800 subsection 2 requiring a highway system, kind of mapping out all of the need, I just wanted to share a little bit from Springfield's example. So in 2014, we developed our own Springfield specific TSP Then I led a follow-on project to help implement the policies in our TSP by updating the local development code. And as part of that, we had developed a conceptual local street network map, which I believe is basically what these rules are calling for. And I think there's value. We want to support connectivity for sure. But I just want to note that that was the topic that received the most public comments and was the most politically hot topic throughout the adoption process and caused multiple more meetings and delay and revisions over time. We ultimately got to a place where we have street network standards in our code that were supported by both our planning commission, the city council, and the Lane County Board of Commissioners. But it was quite a process. And I think that as presented, we maybe don't have the flexibility. I guess the question to staff is, as things change over time, how would amendments to that be made? Because if you plan for a rigid system, it's a kind of steady state situation, things happen, things change. Sometimes you need to vacate a right of way to put in a school, for instance. What would be the flexibility kind of ongoing to make changes to the plan?
So I'm sorry, were you saying you put together for local streets a conceptual network in future areas? Okay, yeah, the rules as we've written, I think we actually wrote an exemption specifically for that to say, you need to figure out in general terms, we don't even need specific right of way. This is existing practice, is my understanding, is that you kind of corridors for your arterials and collector network. And then you'll say, this will be where local streets go, but we don't require a specific layout of local streets in the rules.
Okay, so these rules would just be looking at arterial and collector
for the future network. Yeah, in future areas.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the intent anyway. And I think it might be kind of at the end. I'm just trying to open it up here at the end of 310. I can't remember where I put that right now, but I'm pretty sure there's something. I hope it didn't come out. We did say something about like the local street network need not have existing specific locations for local streets. Yeah.
I would love to know where that is. Thank you. Because
yeah, I'll have to find it for you. Yeah.
It's very different than local streets where
absolutely
there's a dead end street currently that's planned to go through. You will have people coming out to the public hearing in droves saying, I don't want traffic on my street, which I think is an equity issue. And we do need the connectivity. Just bringing up the concerns that we experienced recently in our adoption process. So thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So Commissioner, and then we'll go to Sarah and Michael.
Thank you. I want to go back to what Julie and Matt raised at the start about evaluating existing projects in TSPs. And I think we just have to be aware that local governments very well could have been collecting system development charges, acquiring right-of-ways, a lot of things for projects that are in their adopted TSPs, but they have not yet built those. And so that's one factor. My next question, and I just want to make sure, interested in a reaction to that, but I want to go to my question first, or maybe it's just a comment. This would be in the TSP update. Well, TSP updates, we know, are comprehensive plan amendments. And in theory, these comprehensive plan amendments are going to be addressing a whole range of issues that we're discussing now, which are to address climate-friendly and equitable communities. If the update is appealed because of an evaluation of an existing project in a TSP, the TSP update will it'll be appealed, it could be denied, something of that nature. And if it's then denied, we go back to the current TSP that we have, which has the very project that we just evaluated in it. So I just think we have to be careful that we don't have an unintended consequence that the TSP update is appealed and denied and all the things we're trying to achieve don't happen, yet the project that we just reevaluated continues as originally planned. So I'm interested in any reactions on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting potential issue that we need to maybe think through. What I hear you saying is the existing acknowledged plan has capacity increase projects in there, and how do we treat those maybe differently than new ones? That's a good question. I think we're happy to have that discussion.
For me, it was just Julie had exactly the right example, and you responded very well to it with the 5-lane road and that evaluation. So that was the example that was in my mind.
And Julie, did you want to say more on that topic since you had brought it up originally?
Yeah, I mean, I think Commissioner Lilacs added point about, collecting, transportation system development charges is very valid. I mean, we just updated our transportation system development charge methodology in 2019. And so we have, a whole list of projects. We doubled our cost per trip rate. And, so based on these assumptions, and so I'm trying to figure out how this will affect that list. And yeah, my head's sort of exploding, but I am concerned about having to suddenly, do this very involved process just to keep the project for which we have already been collecting money in our adopted plan, and then, the potential, of course, of also getting appealed. And anyway, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Sarah, let's go to you.
Thanks. And I started just wanting to say one thing, but now it's turned into like 6 things, of course, because I've been waiting. So I'm Sarah Wright with Oregon Environmental Council. I'm an alternate for Mary Kyle McCurdy. So first, I was initially wanted to respond to Matt's comments about emergency vehicle access. And I think that that's a really interesting concern that absolutely needs to be considered. And I just want to point, these are problems that we know there are solutions for that don't involve widening roads. Other places around the world address this, and we can do that too. So from what I've seen from other countries, the key to being able to access your street space for emergency situations, like with emergency vehicles or for evacuation, is to reduce the number of private vehicles that are taking up space on that road. So if you're concerned about evacuation on a 28-foot street, it seems like it would be most effective to focus, as Emma said, on managing on-street parking, because that's going to be the thing that's going to be in your way is the private vehicles. So second, I feel like the comments that I've been hearing really highlight the need for addressing TSP updates. And it really sounds like the incentive would be, without a requirement to update the TSPs, it seems like the incentive would be, honestly, for locals to delay TSP updates in order to continue with projects that wouldn't meet the requirements, and so kind of grandfathered in. So I definitely hear the concerns about how to make that transition, and that needs to be thoughtful, but I do think it's really important to make sure that we don't wait 20 years for a TSP update where we actually get to apply these rules. And then I just, in response to the comments about electrification versus VMT reduction for climate impact, I just really appreciated Bill's point, and I want to really underline that all the analysis on climate impacts of transportation indicate that it's super urgent that we both reduce driving by at least 20% and that we electrify the remaining miles driven. And these are not mutually exclusive, and we need to be doing both at once as quickly as possible. So I really appreciate DLCD's commitment to that. And reducing driving has enormous co-benefits beyond climate, like reducing air toxics and traffic violence and allowing more efficient use of our public space. And all of those co-benefits have huge equity payoffs, and that should matter to all of us given the name of this rulemaking. So the last thing I wanted to just touch on is that every person in Oregon is a user of the transportation system, not just drivers. At least a third of the population doesn't have access to driving a personal vehicle. And every one of those people deserves to have safe and convenient access to the things that they need to thrive. And if that's not a key part of this process, that would make me really sad. So those are just some of the things that have come up as I've been listening, and I really appreciate all the thoughtful conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate that. And Michael, let's go to you, and you might have the last word on this, or last comment on this topic before we move into a break.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to echo a lot of what has already been said, basically everything that Sarah just said. I fully support, endorse. Also, Elisa's comments earlier about local streets. Regarding the issue about emergency vehicles in particular, I've heard that the excuse, I call it an excuse for maintaining the width of arterials. But at the same time, I live in Portland, and I think I just looked, 54 people have died on city streets in Portland this year so far. And so what is the cost of keeping, Barber Boulevard or Powell or others or Outer Division? What is the cost that we are paying for keeping these arterials in the off chance that there will be, an earthquake or whatever emergency? And I think Sarah hit the nail on the head with there are better ways to manage how emergency vehicles get to from point A to point B. One other comment I had was Bill had mentioned earlier about basically retrofitting is really expensive, and he gave the point about storm drainage. And I think this goes to the point of making sure we get our designs better from the get-go so that we don't have to retrofit. We don't have to address curbs again. We don't have to move curbs from one, or work on sidewalks because they're not paved the right way. And so if we apply principles of universal design that have accessibility first and foremost as a main criteria, then we will avoid a lot of expense. And the last thing is again, something that Bill said about the aging population. And many people that I know that have gotten older, they don't want to drive. It's not that they can't drive. Maybe they can't drive, but they don't want to drive anymore. And because we are an aging population, and because many people won't be able or desirous of driving, we need to really pay attention to all these matters. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. And maybe, Bill, anything to kind of close out this topic before we head into a break?
No, thank you all. I think there's a few pieces of this definitely we need to still think through. I do want to highlight one thing around emergency vehicles real quick. That 28-foot number didn't come out of nowhere. That was developed probably about 20 years ago through Transportation Growth Management Program. Did a pretty substantial project on neighborhood street design. Had a work group including fire officials working on trying to figure out what's the right, how skinny can we get, right? Basically, right, based on apparatus and everything for emergency access. And so that number comes from that work that has been done already together with emergency services officials. So I feel pretty comfortable about that piece of it. Obviously, I think people have brought up some things about parking management and other kind of issues. I think those are absolutely critical as well. So it's not a matter of just plopping down the street and hoping it works. It's actually managing the facility as well. But thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. Okay, well, let's take a break and get back together at 10:20. And when we get back, we will talk about the climate-friendly areas rules and get into breakout rooms. So take a break. We'll see you at 10:20. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everyone. Okay, so we're going to move into a discussion on revisions to the rules for climate-friendly areas. So Kevin Young will just provide some background and go over some of the revised rules, and then we'll get into a little bit of discussion. And we actually have some Zoom polls that we'll be using to gauge sort of, from your perspective, are the climate-friendly area rule revisions on the right track? And then we'll get into breakout rooms to talk about this a little further, and then get back for some report outs. And this is a little bit of a change to the original agenda you saw. So we're putting in some more time for the climate friendly areas topic than you saw on the original agenda. And we'll be taking this topic through about 11:25. So Kevin, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Again, Kevin Young, DLCD staff. Yeah, so I'm going to focus really on the changes that have been made. You saw our first draft rules, I think, went out in August. We've got quite a bit of feedback on it. You know, two of the big concerns I think we heard were the pretty relatively short implementation timelines, as well as prescriptive standards. We heard that feedback. We took those questions to our Commission, Land Conservation and Development Commission, in September. And the commission also felt that, yes, we probably need to look at amending implementation timeline, as well as some interest in the idea of outcome-based standards as opposed to prescriptive standards. So I'm going to just kind of talk through the changes that have been made in the rules. Next slide, please, Bill. Thank you. So changes have been made in a number of areas. First of all, as I just mentioned, phased implementation requirements for local governments. Another change was to move the threshold up for cities that would be, cities and counties were required to designate climate-friendly areas. The population threshold now over 5,000. The thinking there is really that when we look at the scale of some of those smaller cities, didn't really make sense. And so I'll talk to that standard in a little more detail later on. We also have a revised approach to how these standards or similar standards would roll out in the Portland metro region. We've created a pared down list of land use requirements for climate friendly areas, really trying to focus in more on the critical components of what should be occurring within climate friendly areas. We've developed an alternative outcomes-based approach for land use requirements. Bill has already spoken to the alternative transportation performance standards within climate-friendly areas. I won't go into more detail on that. I think we've already talked about it, but just know that that's a new piece that you didn't see with the last draft. And then lastly, an alternative approach to urban growth boundary expansions, or how climate-friendly area designation would relate to UGB expansions. So I'm going to go ahead and step through those topics here in a little more detail. Go ahead, next slide. All right, so on the phased implementation requirements, what we've done is basically it's a two-step process. The first step would be the designation of climate-friendly areas, and we've basically put all the local governments into the same timeline. We had different timelines for smaller and larger. On further reflection, we felt, now really it makes sense to just have all the local governments with the same timeline. And so again, the requirement here for designation is for all local governments with population above 5,000 to designate those climate-friendly areas by June 30th, 2023. So basically about a year or a little more after the rules would be adopted. That designation includes just really two key steps, which is describing the area or areas. You can have one or multiple climate-friendly areas. And also completing the analysis of equitable housing outcomes for the area or areas of designation. And that gets to one of the things we've talked about quite a lot is the potential for displacement of underserved populations. We want to make sure we build that analysis in at the beginning, and that the local government is looking at those issues and also identifying strategies that would mitigate for potential displacement impacts. The second phase is the zoning part. So this would come 1 year after the designation. And the requirement here would be for the local governments to adopt both zoning and comprehensive plan amendments by June 30 of 2024. So essentially this is adoption of land use requirements for climate friendly areas and adoption of a climate friendly area element to the comprehensive plan, both of which are described in the draft rules. All right, next slide, please. Okay. In relation to the local governments in the Portland metro region, we've changed things fairly significantly. And essentially, the revised rule requires Metro, the regional government agency, to establish a requirement for local government adoption of Region 2040 centers and land use regulations no later than December 31, 2024, as part of their update to their urban growth management functional plan. Okay, so that's the first step. Establish that as a requirement. Following that, local governments that have not yet adopted those centers and land use regulations would need to comply by December 31 of 2025, 1 year later. The other requirement for local governments within the metro region would be for all cities with a population over 10,000 to report on affordable housing production, mitigation of displacement, and increasing housing choices within those 2040 centers every 6 years. That would be done as part of the housing production strategy work that is currently required. So that was a new standard that came in place with passage of House Bill 2003. Within the Portland metro region, local governments need to update their housing needs analyses, and then subsequently 1 year later adopt housing production strategies every 6 years. And so that's how that would tie in within the metro region. All right, next slide, please. Okay, in terms of land use requirements, the rule essentially sets out some sort of basic requirements that would apply either with the more prescriptive approach or with the outcome-based approach that I'll outline in a minute. So regardless of which path the local government chose to go down, these would be the basic requirements for climate-friendly areas. Of course, allowing mixed uses, including residential, office, retail services, and public uses. There is a new standard in the rule that allows abutting areas with high concentrations of housing or employment uses to be included or to qualify as climate-friendly areas. The thinking there is that if these abutting areas are within easy walking distance of mixed-use, walkable mixed-use area, then either concentrated employment areas or concentrated housing areas are going to support the vibrancy and customer base or utilization of those mixed-use core areas. So that's included in the rule. We also ask local governments to prioritize government facilities, parks, and open space in or near climate-friendly areas. And I will note, since this draft of the rule has gone out, we have received some input with concerns about, hey, what about green infrastructure and other elements that might be included in the rules? I'll tell you honestly that it's been a little challenging to think of how we might do a one-size-fits-all or put those kind of requirements into rule language. Our thinking has been some of that will be in the guidance that follows rule adoption. But we have an additional survey question in our follow-up survey that goes out today. This is a question that wasn't actually in the packet, but we want to get a little more input from you on this question. So something for you to think about as you're reflecting on our conversation today. Of course, also included within the climate-friendly areas are the requirements for the better transportation options and facilities, so high quality bike, pedestrian, transit, infrastructure services, parking reform, as well as a critical component within those climate-friendly areas too. And then the last piece is really those two options for local governments, either that prescriptive or the outcome-based standards. Next slide, please, Bill. So this table summarizes our proposed approach. And as you'll see, we have it kind of batched out in terms of population. So those smallest cities between basically 5 and 10,000. In terms of the climate-friendly area requirements, it's simply at least 25 acres of the area within their jurisdiction should be designated as a climate-friendly area. If the local government chooses to follow a prescriptive path, they would need to establish minimum residential densities of 15 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height that's no less than 50 feet. Those are the kind of the key pieces for creating the synergy we need to see in climate-friendly areas. Alternatively, a local government who may be satisfied that, hey, we have existing standards that we think will get us there, or maybe developing a code that they think does a better job than these basic standards, could basically follow the outcome-oriented standard. And as part of basically proving up on that standard, they would need to demonstrate that, hey, this package of regulations would result in 20 homes and jobs per net acre. So we're looking at that mix, both residential and employment opportunities within these areas. And so basically the standards scale up from there. You'll notice that for local governments over 10,000, the standard then moves to that 30% of housing needs. So again, that climate-friendly area needs to be, or climate-friendly areas need to be sized to accommodate at least 30% of identified housing need within those areas. Then we have, for the prescriptive standards, sort of increasingly higher minimum residential densities, increasingly higher maximum building heights. And then the outcome-oriented standards have sort of increasing levels of jobs and homes per net acre as kind of our goal. All right, next slide, please. All right, and I think this is the last slide. So this is basically the changes to the housing rule. So again, cities over 10,000 would be required to monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas. That's not a change from the prior draft. The housing production strategy analysis will help to identify tools to facilitate housing development in climate-friendly areas. We are really wanting this to be a learning opportunity for all of us within the state to look at what tools are working very well to basically incentivize housing development within climate-friendly areas. The big change here has to do with the UGB expansion. So the first draft of the UGB standards essentially said, look, local governments would need to achieve that 30% of housing units, I think it was by 2026, in order to expand an urban growth boundary. And folks who commented on that standard raised some concerns about, well, what does that do to housing affordability? And might there be some unintended consequences that might result from that rule? We thought more about it and decided, yeah, that's probably something we need to modify. And so the revised rules set a deadline of, well, not a deadline, but I guess a threshold date of June 30, 2027. So beginning on that date, actually probably should be July 1 as I think about it now, but doesn't really matter. Urban growth boundary expansions that are based on residential needs would trigger additional climate-friendly area designation requirements. And essentially, this is a way for us to acknowledge and move our development model into a more walkable mixed-use kind of paradigm. We can't continue to develop low-density residential subdivisions that are dependent on single occupant vehicle trips. We know that if we're going to meet our climate goals. And so this revised standard would basically require additional CFA designation in conjunction with urban growth boundary expansions. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, thank you. Sylvia, I don't know if you want to, if there are clarifying questions, I think that's where we wanted to go with this, but I'll let you speak.
Yeah, perfect. I think we do want to take a few clarifying questions, but we also want to kind of do a quick poll with the group to see whether you think the climate-friendly area rule revisions are on the right track. So I might just go ahead and open that poll, Ingrid, so that people can, you know, think about that and respond, and we can take some clarifying questions at the same time. So Ingrid, if you're there, if you don't mind just launching that poll, and people can answer that question while we're taking some hands here. So let's see, let's go to Sarah first and then Julie.
Thanks. Again, I'm Sarah Wright with the Oregon Environmental Council, and one is a clarifying question and one is probably just an annoying question, maybe clarifying. One is, can you tell me, does the equity, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but does the equity displacement analysis requirement for CFAs apply in the Portland metro region as well? So that's my first question. And then the other is, these density requirements still feel a little low to me, and I'm just wondering how you pinned them down as being kind of sufficient. Thanks.
You bet. Good question. So to answer your question on within the Portland metropolitan area, no. The displacement work, that analysis would not be required. And the reason is that the region has already developed their 2040 growth concept, their climate smart communities program. They have embedded those considerations in the work that they have done. And so as proposed here, we're not requiring that work to be done in terms of establishing or doing analysis within what are already identified town and regional center areas. As to the second question about where the densities, those requirements came from, I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, we've looked at a few different scenarios. We know that at a base minimum, 15 dwelling units per acre is needed to support good quality transit service. Portland Metro has kind of established sort of target densities for their town and regional centers, and we've kind of teed off their standards as well. But I think we're certainly open to input on, and data would be super helpful if people have other ideas about what those standards should be. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. And Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager, City of Salem. My question is a clarifying question on the 30% of housing in the climate-friendly areas. Are you talking about 30% of total housing or 30% of the future needed housing? I see the word needed in some places, but I guess I also thought that the statewide transportation strategy was talking about 30% of all housing. Anyway, can you clarify that?
It is all housing. And that's a good question about the difference between needed housing and all housing. Essentially within and this all kind of ties into the housing needs analysis that local governments have done and will continue to do. It's now, we refer to it as housing capacity analysis, but it's basically the same thing where the local government goes through an exercise where they look at their existing land availability, different zones, they look at their population projections and go through an exercise to determine, do we have sufficient land, residential land, to meet our housing needs over the planning period. So that is kind of the big tent of needed housing. So that identified housing needs over the planning period. So to answer your question more clearly, Julie, it's all needed, all housing, essentially. I mean, it's not just the new stuff, it's we want to see over time at least 30% of the community's housing within climate-friendly areas.
Okay, well, you might want to try doing some clarification because on page PDF page 22 of 145, when you talk about in your memo, you talk about sufficient to accommodate at least 30% of needed housing units. And so it's a little bit unclear.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Damien and then Rob.
All right, thank you. So I think somewhat related to Julie's question, but regarding the proposed rules regarding UGB expansions, my question is on employment land. So I wanted to clarify if, I'm trying to think how to phrase my question. So right now it looks like with employment land, we would still be following the, current goal 9 process, goal 14 process. If we're looking at a potential UGB expansion focused on employment land. However, I think with our recent experience, we included lands in our UGB that were intended to accommodate multiple needs, so not just employment, but employment, housing, and I'll call public facilities like school sites, park sites. So can you clarify what that process might look like if we're looking at a UGB expansion that has multiple needs? I can't contemplate yet. We might have like a future UGB expansion that might be focused on employment, but that's possible. But assuming we have one that's looking at multiple needs, is what's proposed in the Division 8 rules simply an additional set of work that would be focused on housing, or have you thought about how looking at employment lands would be factored into what we're looking at with respect to the climate-friendly rules?
It's a good question, Damien. I think, yes, the proposed framework would work either for a residential only UGB expansion or for a UGB expansion that's looking at residential employment and maybe public facility needs over time. The way it would work is essentially it looks at the identified residential needs. So what is the residential need beyond what can be accommodated within the current urban growth boundary? Say that's a number of housing units, say it's 500 housing units, then the rule would essentially say half of that, and I need to be careful here. It's not saying half of it would be accommodated within a climate-friendly area, but it is saying the local government needs to designate additional climate-friendly areas that would accommodate at least 250 dwelling units. That can be within the UGB expansion area if it makes sense as a climate-friendly area, or it may be somewhere else within the local government jurisdiction. So tying that number to the identified residential land need can be done either in a wholly just purely residential UGB expansion or through a UGB expansion that's done for a variety of needs. If you're getting at the potential for mixed use development in the areas that might be brought into the UGB, that also can be factored in, as a sort of what we anticipate the housing mix within that additional mixed use area, which may or may not be a climate friendly area. I know it's really complicated, but I think that will work.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Damien and Kevin, for the response. And let's go ahead and share the poll results here. I think, maybe not everyone has participated, but several have. So, there are quite a few of you that still see that the rules are not quite there and need more work. So would encourage you to bring up those concerns. Today, we just have about 5 more minutes for the large group kind of questions and discussion, then we'll get into breakout rooms so we can talk about that more there. But thanks, it's good to gauge kind of where people think the rules are at. So Rob, over to you, and then to Emma.
Hi, Rob Innerfeld, City of Eugene, Transportation Planning. The section about residential or employment-oriented zoned areas within half mile of a mixed-use area zone, or says may be included within a climate-friendly area. Is there any limit on the size of those residential or employment-oriented zone areas? Is it, as long as they touch that half mile, is that adequate?
That's a really good question, Rob, and I recognize now that the rule is not specific to that. The thinking behind that was whatever portion of those areas is within that walkable distance would qualify. If there is additional high density further out, it would not qualify.
Right. Well, the example I've given in Eugene, which maybe this is partially responding to, is we have a big, between our downtown and campus, there's a neighborhood that's pretty high density student population, but parts of it, most of it probably not zone mixed use, even, it's high density housing. I don't know what the size of it is, in terms of square miles, but that's, just thinking about a situation like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So just maybe think about how to clarify that section of the rule.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And Emma?
Thank you. Emma Newman, City of Springfield Senior Transportation Planner. 2 questions. First is by designate, and I'm looking at the timeline for rule implementation, for the designating the climate friendly areas, does DLCD mean identify? Because I'm trying to differentiate between like a process that involves the public hearings process and adoption, or solely staff work and analysis that's kind of queuing up the areas to then go into the zone amendments as the second step that follows on. That's my first question. The second question, I saw the mention of minimum climate friendly area widths, and I'm trying to figure out what problem that's trying to solve for. That would make it so that our Glenwood refinement plan area, which went through decades of planning, is mixed use, is between a frequent transit network with the MX running right along it and the beautiful Willamette River in the central Eugene Springfield area. It wouldn't qualify, even though it's planned to support the types of uses and development that we're talking about with this rulemaking. So just trying to figure out what problem it's trying to solve, and could it be solved some other way perhaps?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. So, okay, so your first question had to do with the designation and the governmental action that would be associated with that. Yeah. What we would be looking for there is a local government decision, likely, I mean, is it adoption by ordinance or resolution? I don't know that we've fully clarified that yet, but essentially it is saying, these are the areas, or this is the area we are actively engaged in, working towards zoning this to be a climate friendly area. We haven't figured out what the standards are yet, but it's essentially identifying that area and then doing that sort of analysis of equitable housing outcomes that might result with that. So that would be the first piece, but we would be looking for some official local government decision that would come to us, and we can clarify that further, probably need to in rule. That's the first action. The second would actually be the zone changes in the comp plan amendment that would follow it. On the second question, the width requirement gets to concerns that if these climate friendly areas tend to focus just on narrow transit served corridors, we're not getting the full benefits that would occur with wider areas, and we want to see a certain synergy, a certain critical mass, if you will, of activity in these areas. And if it's overly linear, it's less likely to occur. I hear your point, and obviously at this point it is a draft. And we're open to thoughts about that. I'm familiar with the Glenwood area, and you've got some site-specific constraints, so appreciate the example.
Yeah, I would say corridors that are served by frequent transit should be exactly where we're looking at building climate-friendly areas. So if that's saying we're trying to avoid putting climate-friendly areas along those corridors, that's not what I would envision for this rulemaking.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Emma. All right, well, I think in a second we can get into breakout rooms to talk about this further. And in those rooms, we really just, want to open up the conversation to what do you want to tell each other about the rules for climate friendly areas? And do you think they're on the right track? What concerns do you have? are they even making sense? So just kind of have an open conversation there, and even show, talk to each other about examples of what might a climate friendly area look to you? And do you have a vision or example of something you've seen elsewhere, or just something that you envision? So we'll get in the breakout rooms in just a second, and we'll be in those for about 25 minutes. And we'll have a facilitator, note taker in each. And then when we get back together, we'll do some report outs, and we'll ask RAC members to help with those report outs. And of course, always looking for new voices. If you haven't reported out in a while, we would love for you to volunteer if you're feeling brave today. So Ingrid is going to whisk us away into breakout rooms, and we will have until 11:15 in our breakout rooms, and then we'll get back into the large group, so 11:15. And when you get the breakout room button on your screen that says join, just go ahead and click join, or it might happen automatically depending on your version of Zoom. So Ingrid, do your magic. Thank you.
Hi there. Would the person who's here on the phone like to go into a breakout room? Could you tell me who you are?
Yes, this is Oriana Manera from Verde. Feel free to put me in a breakout room.
Okay. Hi, Ariana. Just a moment. Hello. I'm Maggie.
I came back a little later than I thought, but I'll just turn off screen and wait for the breakout sessions to.
Yeah, they're about to close, about 1 minute.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome back, everyone. Those breakout rooms went by very quickly for us. I don't know about the rest of you, but hopefully you had some good conversation there. So we're going to get into report outs now, and we'll start first with room 1, which was my room, and we had Sarah Adams shown that'll report out, and then we'll move to room 2, Cody Meyer's room, and then room 3, Matt's room. So Sarah, over to you first for just a quick, 1 minute high level, a few key themes or ideas that came out from your breakout room.
All right, yes. And just as a note, it's Sarah Adams Shane, even though it's spelled Schoen, it's like, if you can think of Danke Shane, it's the Yiddish pronunciation of Shane. Yeah, so the high level are that the rule, it seemed in the group that there was a sense that the rules are getting there, but there's need to think about, continue to think about consequences and supporting cities in development standards. Some concern regarding the timeline and whether or not really it reflects the urgency of the climate situation. A need for it to be clear about what has to be accomplished. And there is some concern about whether the rules are limiting consumer or developer choice in a way that won't be reflective of market demands. There was discussion of this, really a vision of a place where the CFA is a place where people feel safe walking and not being in a car, including people from historically and currently underrepresented communities. And what's needed in a place like that, like for example, a multicultural center or a creative space. And also, whether or not the 50% in terms of the urban growth boundary expansion needs and density in the CFAs, where that number comes from and or whether that number is going to really be reflective of what needs to be accomplished. A need to evaluate over time the impact of the CFAs in terms of affordability and displacement. That's already somewhat in the rules, but really making sure we keep that focus and that we do it adequately. I'll just stop there since I'm sure I'm well over a minute.
No worries. Thank you so much. And Cody's group, room 2.
Great. Yeah, Wade Elliott's going to present here.
Hi, my name is Wade Elliott. I'm representing room 2. Sorry. So we highlighted a few different things. The climate-friendly areas, they absolutely need to have an equity focus that has an eye towards, different gentrification. We also identified a need for a lot of public engagement, which may end up requiring or necessitating some extensions of some of the timeframes for implementation in order to do it right and get the community behind it. We also had some of the same concerns over whether or not the market actually supports it. And I think that was seen throughout all the members of our group. And there was also general approval of the iterative design of the rules. So thank you guys for the help through this. And a couple of the examples, there's one out of the Springfield area that was, they thought the Glenwood corridor might be a good one. But under the current rules, it doesn't actually, wouldn't meet the criteria and the requirements. So even though it'd be good, some of the rules are a little bit too stringent for that. That's it. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Wade. Let's go to room 3, Matt's group, and then room 4, Bill's group.
Damian Cernick is reporting for us.
All right, thanks, Matt. So our group spent quite a bit of time looking at how the rules would apply to existing areas that we have in cities. And our group included Bend, Medford, and Kaiser, and trying to think through, what that would mean to, what changes might be necessary to, close that gap between what's already been done to promote development in some of our areas that might qualify as climate-friendly areas and where they are today. We also spent some time talking about how cities will need to potentially work differently with ODOT and what that means in terms of how we work with ODOT based on the changes in the rules so that we can ensure safe travel in CFAs by foot, by bike, by transit, but also recognize that freight moves into these areas as well. And I think Commissioner Lilac finished with a good question that I want to make sure we raise here, which is, as we're talking about the rules, we're looking at things like the width of CFAs, height limits, but here is the bigger question about how will we achieve equity? And I know speaking for myself, that's something I need to go back and look at again with the current draft rules, because I've been fixating quite a bit about height limits, width, timelines, but I have not thought more in depth about what steps the city is going to need to take to mitigate displacement and gentrification as a result of potentially identifying certain areas of Bend as climate-friendly areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. And room 4, Bill's group.
Yeah, so I forgot to ask for someone to report out. So unless I've got a volunteer in the next 2 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and do it myself. One thing so that came up is, I think people, why didn't you ask us this earlier? What CFA should be? I think there was some frustration maybe that there could have been some earlier participation in this process as part of the development of the rules. There's some questions about, kind of that line of what is or what isn't a CFA, and there, gave some examples of some neighborhoods where there's some multifamily development near shopping, and there's people that walk back and forth, and, is that a CFA? Is that a mini CFA? Is it not? And why not? And where should that line be? And some thought about that. We had a discussion about what the rules might mean for tenure, for ownership versus rental, and whether or not the rules might be, encouraging a lot more rental stock and discouraging ownership or homeowner, owned housing, and whether or not we wanted to visit that and take a look and see if there's other types of land uses that we might want to include in climate-friendly area that would encourage home ownership. That we need to make sure that we're planning for decreasing vehicle miles traveled. If that's what we expect, that we make sure that we're planning for that in these areas and expecting that. And that, when we're prioritizing projects in the transportation system plan, to make sure those things are happening and that we're, making sure that the right kinds of projects to support development in climate-friendly areas are being prioritized properly. And I unless someone else has something else to add, that's what I got.
Thank you, Bill. All right, and then let's go finally to group 5, Evan's group.
Thank you. I got volunteered to report out. Yeah, a few things. There's some current concern about lines on map needing significant public engagement and not having enough time to do that. The lack of market study and concerns on whether we can actually see development in these things, and if we're spending a bunch of resources and development's not going to happen. That was a concern. There's concern about actually funding and developing the high quality bike and ped facilities in the CFAs. And then there were some related questions about the bike ped rules overall, and owning a quarter mile of schools, and the inventorying, and the concern about kind of the vague language of substantial instead of having specific numbers in there for maximum, minimum widths and things like that. And thinking about how we allocate the right of way. And a desire to think about speed and volume in terms of building out the bike system. So yeah, and people imagine downtowns generally being what climate friendly areas look like. Anyone have other things to add?
Thank you, Evan, for that great summary. Kevin, I know we have to move to the next topic in just a second, but any kind of 30-second wrap up on next steps for the rules for climate friendly areas, or any final observations?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, a lot of great input. So I appreciate everyone contributing today and continuing to think about this. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out after this meeting interest in work groups. I think it's very, very possible we'll have a work group on climate friendly areas, further refining these requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, well, we're going to move into our final topic for today, which is rules for electric vehicle charging and reducing parking mandates. So I'm going to hand it over to Evan to walk us through that. And we're going to do a couple of polls afterwards too, to see if you feel like these rules are kind of on the right track, and then have time for a little bit of large group discussion before we wrap up today.
Thank you. Bill, are you pulling this up? Or okay, perfect. So parking reform and electric vehicle charging. Revised draft of the parking reform rules was in your packet. I pointed out 27 changes. There were probably a few more because we got a lot of great input. So thank you all those who participated and sent comments and language suggestions and things like that. The largest changes I'll go over. Some smaller changes I won't. The first is it was significantly restructured. The pieces were all there, but we kind of pulled it apart and put it back together, and in a way we thought was easier to understand because people had expressed some frustrations about understanding it and feeling it was unwieldy. We gave people a little bit more time. We also are really hoping that more communities will be encouraged to take the middle of the three tracks, the fair policy track. And so we made that track a little bit easier by saying if communities have a parking mandate of a half space per multifamily unit or below, they get a credit towards that track. So trying to make that track easier to take and more attractive. We removed a lot of specificity. We did put in one specific thing about parking maximum numbers instead of just leaving it totally vague for those places that parking maximums would apply. It doesn't feel super aggressive to us, but there is at least a number in there. There's a placeholder for how this applies in the metro area. Next week, I'm conducting some conversations with our local partners throughout the metro area, 3 different conversations, and metro regional government to kind of think through how this might apply and given Metro's unique role in our planning system. And the last thing on the parking reform piece if for those paths 2 and 3 in my brain, and I know I'm referring to numbers that maybe your brain is saying, hey, we really want to make sure that those people in multifamily units who aren't consuming parking aren't paying for it. So if you're going to require parking to be built, you have to unbundle that in those key areas that we're trying to really accelerate parking reform, climate friendly areas, and along priority transit. Yeah, and as previously mentioned, we reduced some specificity. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the 1, 2, and 3 that I talked about, or that I referred to. The fair parking policies, track 2, as I said, is something that we think is the data show is most likely to actually get us to our goals. So adopting those policies, like you could do track 1 and adopt those policies, we'd be thrilled. That's I think get us to further our most climate and equity goals, but really trying to make sure that we do have options that communities can use. And hopefully this graphical representation of how that all works after some stuff earlier on in the rules is helpful to folks. So this is the memo. If you're trying to understand it, I refer you to the memo, and you can kind of think through how the options for parking reform might work in your community. Next slide. So the EV charging stuff, it's been a challenge, frankly, to really dig into the specificity here and understand where the work is needed and where our authority lies. So this is what we've done in this draft. The old draft kind of focused on, hey, let's put some wiring and chargers in because we thought that that's where the additional help might be needed. But looking at what the law actually was and where the costs are, we've kind of said, hey, we actually want to make sure that as we build new development, we future-proof it for this EV future that the state is aimed towards. And so the new draft is really focused on having electric capacity in the building and having conduit. That's why the bracket only goes it says wiring, and it's like, okay, this is the conduit, this is the wiring itself. So we're hoping that if the capacity and the conduit exists, that as demand demands, that it will be relatively easy to put in the wiring and the charging, which could be just a plug, or it could be a fancy charging station. It could be a variety of things. So that's kind of the rethought on where we're focusing these draft rules. And given, and we also kind of rethought, hey, some of this residential capacity, level 1 works okay for overnight charging. But if we are actually thinking about the building stock for the next 80 or 100 years, and we're actually going to meet our state goals, we should increase the residential number of spaces that should be ready to be plugged in. We reduced the waiver on retrofit. So if this is super expensive on retrofit, anything, if it's more than 1/5 of the cost, you don't have to do it. And then, as I mentioned, kind of going in, we're having ongoing conversations. Our attorney and building codes counsel are talking about exactly where our authority lies and whether our rules can actually specify charging levels and that sort of thing. So it continues to be an open conversation, digging into some pretty obscure things. And I don't want anyone to think that this is clearly our final draft or our proposed final draft, because I think there'll be more adjustments made once we hear back from the attorneys. So that's what we've done on EV charging. And now I'd open it up to clarifying questions and conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Evan. And so we want to open it up to anyone that has questions and discussion. And let's go ahead and Ingrid and pull up those polling questions. We just want to get a sense from the group whether you think that both the parking reform and the electric vehicle charging rules are on the right track. You know, are they getting to the goals of the program? Kind of just let us know, yes, almost, not quite, no, or don't know, not sure. Maybe you're just really not sure if it's getting us there. So go ahead and fill out that poll if you can while we're taking some questions and hearing additional comments. So I'd encourage anyone that has any clarifying questions or comments to just go ahead and raise your hand. All right, let's go to Emma and then Damien.
Thank you. I don't want to dominate the conversation today, so I'm hoping some of you who are off camera and haven't spoken up, you're also really valuable RAC members, so please also put your hands up and chime in. I wanted to say a big thanks to staff for the immense number of adjustments that you made. I think that this is much closer than it was before. The first version was pretty concerning. Still have a number of comments in detail that I'll provide in the worksheet. My biggest question, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is the management of parking, because for these rules to be successful, parking is a key tool to achieve the outcomes of the rulemaking. But with just putting the rules in as stated, I think it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences that could impact like fire and life safety, response, evacuation, economics, so many different factors. And so my question is, what resources will the state provide to local jurisdictions to pay for parking management programs, to either establish or expand programs if they already exist in communities? And kind of who's working on the resourcing of it? I recognize DLCD's role is one piece, but there's a lot of different state agencies that might be able to provide the support needed to really make it successful.
Well, as you're aware, likely, but not everyone might be aware, the state has published a couple of different manuals on how to do parking management. We also have often funded transportation growth management grants, assisting cities with thinking through how to do parking management. And we will continue to have grants available. They're competitive grants. Some of them are competitive and some are as funds allow. Yeah, generally in talking to folks, parking management can be self-funding as far as implementation, depending on how it's designed. And that's what we heard from LeGrand, for example, is that permits plus tickets enforcement made it so it could be self-funded. But yeah, those are a couple of the resources that are available, and there may be additional resources where we are thinking about additional resources overall and trying to chase them down to help implement the rules overall. But certainly the goal is for communities to use management, which is the more cost efficient and space efficient and climate efficient and all that, rather than just peanut buttering one size fits all. Let's have a lot of parking everywhere. So that's the goal. And if there are specific resources or tools that would be really useful, we'd love to hear about them. And some of them may be additional workshops, trainings, things, and some of it may be consultant. But I'm happy to hear about what would be the most useful tools and think about how we might be able to meet that demand.
Great. And yeah, I think it's really important. I was thinking more along the lines of resources to actually provide the staffing necessary to go out and put a ticket on a hood and then follow up and say, hey, you've been parked here too long, or you haven't paid for the permit, or whatever it is. I know downtown Springfield, we have a parking management program that's time-based, and then a permitting system, just not even including the city staff who have helped like set up the program and support it ongoing, but just the annual costs are about $120,000 per year. I don't know the specifics of revenue, but I know that it's not self-funding. So I'd love to hear from other jurisdictions across the state who have programs that might need to scale up those programs from like a localized downtown area to citywide. What are you thinking? What are your programs currently? What are your needs to make this a success?
Thanks, Emma. And about a dozen of the changes that are noted are from Emma's notes. So thanks for your detailed notes previously and your continued engagement in that.
Thanks, Emma. All right, so Damien, we'll go to you in just a second, but Ingrid, let's go ahead and close the poll and share the results just so that folks can see that. And, you know, can everyone see the results right now? Okay. And we're seeing that for the parking reform, you know, there are quite a few of you that think the rules need more work. Some of you are not sure. And for the EV charging rules, those seem to be a little bit closer to sufficient. So if, you know, those of you especially that think the rules do need more work in either of those areas, parking reform or EV charging, we would really like to hear why. You know, what suggestions do you propose? How could they be better? What are kind of the key concerns that are still outstanding? And I'll go to some of the hands that are still up here. So Damien, over to you.
All right, thank you. I have, I think, a two-part question regarding the EV charging rules. One is related to section 410 sub 2, where there's some discussion about things that are going to need to be required upon a major remodel or renovation. And so my question is, if there's going to be like a forthcoming definition or some guidance on what that means, because I can already hear, for example, discussions that are zoning building counter versus, well, this is not a major remodel, it's a minor remodel, it's not this, it's that. Second part of that is, I seem to recall, I may have the bill number wrong, I think it was may have been House Bill 2180 that was dealing with EV charging and building codes. And could you comment about what I need to inform our building officials so that they're engaged in this work and we can coordinate our efforts effectively?
Thanks, Damien. The major remodel definition is in 2E. So you can look at that and see if that works for you. You're right about the House Bill number 2180, and that's in part the attorneys talking to each other over at Building Codes. Building Codes will have their building code updated by June 30th of next year. And that's going to require 20% of parking spaces to have conduit and have a space on site to have capacity, but wouldn't actually require the capacity. And there are a few other nuanced differences. So we're trying to figure out whether the legislature, if those guidelines are the firm guidelines, and that's the end of the conversation, and so our rules can't come in, or if there's some play there. So happy to follow up with you offline on what's going on with 2180 and building codes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go to Mallory and then Jonathan.
Thanks. And I'm just curious, really, if and how the EV charging pieces are informed by ODOT's transportation infrastructure needs analysis that was recently published in the policy recommendations there.
Yeah, thanks, Mallory. Certainly a fair amount of, we worked to develop these rules in partnership with ODOT, and then the people who ran the TINA study are so very, very much informed, and some of my skepticism they kind of pushed on and said, hey, if we're actually gonna get to the numbers in this, the analysis shows that we don't just need residential parking, because the building infrastructure, a lot of people are gonna live in existing buildings that don't have EV charging. That's why we need commercial charging, for example. As much as most people now charge residential, in the future, 40% of people are gonna be charging non-residential. So so both in terms of overall numbers and in terms of locations and needs, we're pretty informed by the folks who developed that study, and they were really helpful. So I appreciate ODOT's partnership in developing these rules on that.
Thank you. And Jonathan?
Yes, so I queued up to ask a couple of clarifying questions. Maybe I'll make a comment too, if there's time. My first clarifying question is around 0450. the parking management for more populous communities. And the question I have is, how does that relate to the 420 through to the end of it, the other options? And I ask that question because when I read, to remember this is for the higher populous communities, which could include populations of 25,000 in metro, I guess. The first option is adopt land use regulations without mandates, which sounds very much like 420. So I just wonder how those two work together, and is it a build on? So that was one question. The second clarifying question I had was, in some of the options, parking options, there are those things that are not land uses. They're pricing tools or pricing messages. I can't remember what your terminology you use. And if I recall, these are things that DLCD or LCDC can't require because they're non-land use sort of things. So how are those going to be monitored or implemented, and how do they relate to what the jurisdictions have to actually do to implement a parking district or implement an income tax on parking revenue and those sort of things? The comment I want to make to the polling is I am continue to be concerned about the no parking mandate. You don't have to do anything else, as it doesn't establish making sure that we're not overbuilt by having maximums, and it doesn't address unbundling. It just says you don't have any parking standards. So those are my two clarifying questions and a comment.
Yeah. Thank you. So, so you're right that the O450, if people do the O420 path, they don't, O450 doesn't apply it applies in the way that says, okay, you've already waived your parking mandates, so you don't have to price on street parking. So that's how those two fit together, and maybe I can draft that more artfully. The parking, trying to find where this may, yeah, there is a parking maximums requirement in 415, and everything before 420 still applies to everyone. So that's a parking maximums requirement, requiring folks to set appropriate parking maximums in climate-friendly areas and along priority transit corridors. So that's kind of why it's drafted as like, okay, this is the stuff that applies regardless. And then the 420 is the split point where 420 is if you waive your parking mandates, you're done. And the rest of the rule, don't worry about it. So that was that effort. And I think there was a third thing that I haven't addressed, and you're welcome to repeat it briefly or remind me what it was. I'm sorry.
Unbundling, if you go through 420, do you have to unbundle residential, at least residential?
Right. We can't, unbundling is not something that we think we have the authority to require. It's kind of landlord tenant law. So if communities don't want to repeal their parking mandates, then they can do that voluntarily as an option, as part of a complete package 2 or 3. So that's the way we get to things like pricing, things that we don't have authority in. We offer communities, hey, if you want to do it, you can do that stuff, and that we think will have roughly the same effect as the thing we can require. And so that's an option that we provide. Yeah, and happy to continue that conversation offline as well. I know we're running a little short on time, but or further clarify. But I see Rob has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Evan and Jonathan. Yeah, so we'll go to Rob, and then, anyone else, encourage you to raise your hand, especially if you think that the rules aren't quite there. What suggestions do you have to get them there, to meet your vision, or, what concerns can you flag for staff to continue to work on through revisions? So Rob, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. So again, Rob Interfeld, City of Eugene. The primary issue we have with the parking is just the time it would take to adopt the rules. Our planning director said it'll take at least 18 months to go through the process, including the public involvement, going through the planning commission, city council, et cetera. So, I'd encourage DLCD staff to really look at what are all the steps that communities are going to have to go through to adopt these new regulations. And I totally get the urgency around climate change. There's no argument there. But it's more about we all have a lot on our plate, and trying to figure out how are we going to get this all done, and just sort of mapping it out and being realistic about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. Others, anyone else that hasn't had a chance to speak today that wants to bring your voice to the conversation, or just any other concerns, issues to flag here?
If I may, Sylvia.
Sure.
This is Kirsten. I love a good process, and I'm really interested in some of that work that jurisdictions are doing to identify the timeline. So Rob or others, if you would like to share that with our staff, whether it's on the back of an envelope or a full, actual, Word doc, whatever it is, I really appreciated Rob's use of the term appreciative inquiry earlier, and that probably flew by folks. It's not one I hear often enough, but it is generally, and Rob can correct me, but it's just generally the notion that we're appreciating the work that's already been done, and the capacities I'm using sort of my take on it. You can Google it, but it would be a stance that respects the works and the processes that local governments have in place and do, and the capacities they have and built, in the plans and systems and infrastructure they have. So, we do respect that. So anything you guys can share with that detail just helps inform us, and also our commission. It doesn't have to be formal. Again, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your comments and additional thoughts. And of course, there will be the survey after this meeting to provide anything else more specific that you'd like to see in the rules. I think with that, we can probably move into our next steps and wrap up and maybe get out of here a few minutes early today. So I think I'll hand it over to Commissioner Lilac with any closing remarks, and then hand it over to Kevin if you have any kind of next steps you want to flag going forward. So Commissioner Lilac, over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. What a great meeting. And thank you everyone for our first, I think this was our first 4-hour meeting, our first long one. And it's a real commitment. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I know staff, the commission, everybody really appreciates your commitment to this process. It's very, very significant. Great questions today. Thank you for raising your questions, raising the critical issues. It really makes a difference. And I think as we've really seen since August, staff's listening, and they continue to revise the rules based on the input that we're all providing, and that's critical. So to staff, thank you so much. I know you're living this. On the weekends and the evenings, there's a ton of work, and we have, even though we're aiming for a commission adoption next May, there's so much work that I know you're continuing to put into this. Our next meeting is in December, and then again January quickly. So you're going to be spending a lot of time, I know, over the next many months on this. So I want to thank all of you as well. Again, great feedback. Please do take the time to fill out the surveys. It really makes a difference, and it really matters. So with that, Sylvia, I'll turn it back to you, but thanks again to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Yeah, great work, everyone. And your next meeting is December 17th, so Friday, December 17th. Hopefully the last thing you need to do before taking time off for the holidays. And Kevin, any next steps you want to flag before we adjourn today?
Sure, just a couple of reminders. First of all, look for your follow-up surveys. Those will be going out just after the meeting. I'm going to put in a special plug. There's an additional question that you wouldn't have seen in your packet regarding green infrastructure in climate-friendly areas, and I'll be very interested in your input there. We are asking to get those back November 15, so that will allow you 2 weekends, maybe not as much time as you might hope. The reason for that deadline is that we need to make sure that we digest your comments and have the ability to, fold that into the next draft, which we'll review on the 17th. So that said, if you have comments after that date, it's not a drop dead date. What that means is that we cannot, as staff, commit to having looked at and digested your comments for the next iteration. So we're not saying don't give us anything after December 17th, but that is, after November 15th, but that is the point at which we can say, yes, we've looked at and thought about your input and we've folded that into our next iteration. Also, keep an eye out for that email that will be going out soon on your interest in participating in work groups on various topics as we refine the rules that we've talked about today. And I just want to echo what you've heard from, I think, everyone else. Thank you so much for your engagement today. It's a lot to ask to start 8 a.m. on a Friday morning, but wow, people are really, really engaged, really thinking about this stuff. And I know I speak for staff when I say thank you very much for all of your thoughtful input.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thanks, RAC members, for being here today. Have a great rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. See you at the next one on December 17th.
Thanks, Sylvia.